Hi there! This is a special Miss History. You'll have to bear with me if you hear my air conditioner or if you hear the large fan. Dude, it's summertime in Phoenix. The living ain't easy. And if the fish are jumping, it's only because they need to feel the scorching rays of the sunlight before they go back into the cool, refreshing water. No lie. So today, and for probably a few weeks at least, I will be talking about the same thing. This is a case that goes back to the late 1800s. And it was a friend of mine that told me about it because of the fact that the subject of this is a distant relative of his great aunt, to be exact. So I got to do it in parts because there is so much history that I absolutely positively want to get into, and I love history. I've been geeking out on this, and I want to get into all the key players and all of the history, whether it's relevant history or just interesting history that's a side note. It's a good time. So what's so special about this? Well, this has to do with Mary Surratt. Have you heard of Mary Surratt? Do you know why she's famous or even infamous, as the case may be? The reason I picked today, July 7th, to post this first video about Mary Surratt is because on this day in history in 1865, Mary Surratt would be the first woman ever executed by the United States federal government. It is alleged that she was a co-conspirator in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States. But who was she really? She was born Mary Elizabeth Jenkins, and it's kind of up in the air as to what month or even what year she was born. But many historians believe that she was born in May, for sure, but they're not sure if it was 1820 or 1823. She would be born near Waterloo, Maryland, which is present-day Clinton, and she was born to Archibald and Elizabeth Ann Jenkins on a tobacco plantation. They would have two other children. She had brothers, John, born in 1822, and James, born in 1825. Mary's father would actually pass away in the fall of 1825, leaving the property that he lived on, which was originally part of his lordship's kindness estate, and he would leave that to his wife, Elizabeth. So I was curious about his lordship's kindness estate, because it's okay, so that's got to predate America, right? So how did it come about that Archibald and Elizabeth would have this property? And I found really some interesting things on this property that will predate even the American Revolution. So I got looking into the history of this property, and I just thought it was super fascinating, right? So originally, there was a grant for 7,000 acres of land granted to Colonel Henry Darnell in 1703 by Charles Calvert, who was the third Lord of Baltimore and a relative to Henry. Henry was the great-grandfather of Robert Darnell, who was mentioned in the insert. And he would build a home for his family on a nearby piece of property, then known as the Woodyard, sometime between 1683 and 1711. So, Henry Darnell would pass away in 1711, and he would leave the property to his son, Henry Darnell II. The younger Darnell would end up having to dispose of much of the then accumulated 35,000 acres to help clear up some of his son's debts. His son, Henry Darnell III, would then receive the remaining 1,300 acres, including the 300 acres that had been a part of the original 7,000-acre grant. Henry III would be found guilty of embezzling money from one of his appointed positions as a naval officer in 1761, causing fines to be paid by his brother John Darnell and Charles Carroll of Annapolis, and they were his guarantors. And this resulted in the loss of the property to the Darnell family after that. Well done, Henry III. It's possible that the home now known as Poplar Hill is from the latter part of the 18th century, having possibly been built sometime around 1728 for Anne Talbot, who was the niece of the 14th Earl of Shrewsbury, when she married Henry Darnell III, who was then the Attorney General of Maryland between 1744 and 1756. So you remember, the property was lost in 1861. Robert Darnell, the Justice of Prince George's County and the great-grandson of Henry Darnell I, would find a means to buy back the original grant of land, and he would live there between 1770 and 1803. He would go on to replace the original house, and then would die childless in 1803. So he would leave the home to his nephew, Robert Sewell, who was a member of the county's levy court. Robert was residing in a home on a property that he was leasing, that he had added on to the original structure to include the original structure as the kitchen to the much larger structure on what is modern-day Constitution Avenue and is now known as the Sewell House, which you can visit. It is believed that the home was completed around 1800 and was built by the architect Leonard Harbaugh. Yes, the Leonard Harbaugh who designed the Old North for Georgetown University and the old U.S. Treasury Building and the Holy Trinity Church. So upon his uncle's death, Robert would learn that he had inherited this tobacco plantation known as his lordship's kindness. The house on that property was designed by Leonard Harbaugh, which would lend to the credibility to the rumor that he had also designed the Sewell House on Constitution Avenue. Since he had to sort out his new inheritance, Robert would then move to Prince George's County. He would lease out his home on Constitution Avenue to Albert Gallatin, who served as the Secretary of the Treasury under Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. There is even a rumor, though not proven, that the Louisiana Purchase was actually signed in the Sewell House while Gallatin lived there. Another rumor that surrounded the original Sewell House was that during the War of 1812, after the Battle of Bladensburg, British troops marched toward Washington, and it is believed that shots were actually fired from inside of the Sewell House to rout the British troops back in their advancement. This would make the Sewell House the only American resistance to the invasion of the capital by the British. Regardless of whether or not shots were actually fired from the house, the British would set fire to it. The home would be rebuilt and eventually become the property of one of Robert's great nieces. Because like I said, Robert would go to Sewell County or to Prince George's County to settle out that whole estate. And he would leave the property then to his son, Robert Darnell Sewell, who would in turn leave it to his two nieces, Susan and Ellen Dangerfield, in 1853. Susan would marry future U.S. Senator John Strode Barber in 1865, and all the Sewell properties would remain in the family until the death of Ellen in 1912 as she had no heirs. In 1955, a couple by the name of John and Sarah Walton would purchase his lordship's kindness from the Archdiocese of Washington and form the John M. and Sarah R. Walton Foundation, Incorporated, in 1988 in order to preserve his lordship's kindness. The house in Prince George's County opened for public tours in 1991. How the Jenkins family came to own a portion of his lordship's kindness estate, I'm not really certain, but I would venture to guess that it had to do with the original selling off of some of the accumulated 35,000 acres by Henry Darnell II to pay off his son's debts. So Mary's father was a non-denominational Protestant and her mother was an Episcopalian. But Mary would be enrolled in a private Roman Catholic girls' boarding school known as the Academy for Young Ladies in Alexandria, Virginia in 1835. It is believed that it was Mary's maternal aunt, Sarah Webster, who was the influence for where Mary attended school, as Sarah was a practicing Catholic. Mary would convert to Roman Catholicism in 1837 and adopt the baptismal name of Maria Eugenia. The academy would end up closing down in 1839, but Mary would remain an observant Catholic for the rest of her life. Mary would go on to meet John Harrison Surratt in 1839 when he was 26, and depending on what year she was actually born, Mary was either 16 or 19 upon their meeting. Not much is known about John Surratt. He may have been born in 1813 to Jacob Surratt and Sarah Talbert, but was an orphan who would be adopted by Richard and Sarah Neal of Washington, D.C., and the wealthy family would settle in Maryland in the late 1600s. The Neals owned a farm that they would divide among their children, including John. And it is rumored that John had a child out of wedlock at some point and may have even been married to the woman of Caroline before he met Mary. But this is all speculation and conjecture. Nobody really knows. Mary was a once-removed first cousin of Edward Fitzgerald, the father of F. Scott Fitzgerald. Yes, the author of The Great Gatsby. John is said to have been the second cousin of Francis Scott Key, who wrote The Star-Spangled Banner. Interesting. John would end up converting to Roman Catholicism, and he and Mary would get married in August of 1840. John would then purchase a mill in Oxon Hill, Maryland, where the family would settle and have 3 children. Isaac Surratt on June 2nd, 1841. Elizabeth Susanna Surratt, nicknamed Anna, on January 1st, 1843. And John Harrison Surratt Jr., born April 13th, 1844. So the year before the birth of his youngest son, John would purchase 236 acres of land that straddled the D.C. and Maryland border, and he would buy that from his adoptive father, Richard, probably for like 2 chickens and a shekel or something ridiculously low. Anyway, the parcel was named Fox Hall, and it was approximated to be in the area between Wheeler Road and Owens Road today, as shown on the map. John's adoptive father, Richard, would pass away in September of 1843, and a month later, John would purchase an additional 119 acres of land adjoining Fox Hall. It would be around this time that John would move back to his childhood home with Mary and their children to help his mother run the farm. John's adoptive mother, Sarah, would pass away in August of 1845 after an illness. Prior to her death, she deeded the remainder of the Neal farm to John. Mary would go on to get involved in raising funds to build St. Ignatius Church in Oxon Hill, which was constructed in 1850. It is rumored that John was unhappy with Mary's religious activities and his behavior started to change. He would begin to drink heavily, he wouldn't pay his debts, his temper became more violent and more volatile according to historical sources. Now, whether or not any of that is true is up for conjecture. In 1851, the family farmhouse was burned down, allegedly by an escaping slave. It was then when John would find work with the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, and Mary would move with her children into the home of a cousin, Thomas Jenkins, in Clinton. John would go on to purchase 200 acres of farmland within the year near what is now Clinton, and he would build a tavern and an inn in 1853. Initially, Mary would refuse to live in this new residence, instead living on the old Neal farm. John would then sell both the Neal farm and Fox Hall in 1853 to pay back debts, thus forcing Mary and the children to move back in with him that December. Excellent. The money from the sale of the farms, as well as the money he was making at the tavern, would allow John to purchase a townhouse at 641 H Street in Washington, D.C. He would use this as a rental property, which would allow him to build a hotel in 1854 as an addition to the tavern, which he called Surratt's Hotel. The area surrounding the tavern was officially renamed Surrattsville that same year. The town consisted of the tavern, a post office, which was inside of the tavern, a forge, and a few other houses. John would then expand the family's holdings by selling off land to pay down debts and starting new businesses. So over the next few years, John would acquire or build a carriage house, a corn crib, a general store, a forge, a granary, a grits mill, a stable, a tobacco curing house, and a wheelwright shop. This would give the family enough money to send their 3 children to nearby Roman Catholic boarding schools. The boys would attend St. Thomas Manor, and Anna would attend her mother's alma mater, the Academy for Young Ladies. After a while, the debts would start to mount. John would start drinking more and more, forcing him to sell another 120 acres of land in 1856 to pay off their debts. By 1857, all but 600 acres of the family's holding had been sold, which was about 1,200 acres. The family would sell most of their slaves to pay their debts, and still, John was hitting that bottle pretty hard and heavy. Mary would write to her local priest, allegedly, in 1858 to state that John was drunk daily. St. Thomas Manor, where the boys attended, would close in 1860. The oldest, Isaac, would find work in Baltimore, Maryland, and then the Surratts would sell off another 100 acres, and this would allow Anna to remain at the Academy for Young Ladies. John Jr. would enroll at St. Charles College in Maryland. The couple would then borrow money against their townhome in Washington, D.C., and later use that as collateral for another loan. So, like I said, this has to be done in parts because, well, I'm going to look at all of the history, and I mean all of it, because I'm like I said earlier, I am totally geeking out about all of the history, the backstories, everybody involved, and it's just because I find it also very, very interesting, and I hope you do too. I will be working on part 2, so make sure you're subscribed. I give this video a thumbs up if you found this one interesting. Join me on a regular Miss History every Tuesday for part 2. Bye. Hello, welcome back to Miss History. Still hot in Phoenix? Anyway, we're going to get right into part 2 of Mary Surratt. And if you missed the first part, I will link it in the description. But the quick recap is Mary Surratt would be the first woman executed by the United States federal government for her part in the conspiracy to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. So if you were here for part one, you remember that we kind of left off where the family basically had to sell off pretty much everything they owned, save for maybe a few things, to pay off debts. And then they would borrow money against their DC townhome, take it out as collateral for a loan. And all in all, it just sounded like life was rough for the Surratt family, and it was probably made worse by John's drinking. How much of the story of Mary Surratt is fact, and how much of it is myth, is legend, is lore? And that's kind of what I want to explore in this whole entire series. So let's discuss 1860. So the year was 1860, and there had been a lot of tension between the slave states in the South and the free states in the North. As the United States sought to expand west, there would be even more contention as to whether or not states admitted into the Union would be slave or free states. And I always found that to be an interesting debate due to the Founding Fathers adding into the U.S. Constitution in, Section 9 of Article 1, which is the legislative article, and they put in the following: the migration of importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10 for each person. End quote. So, in essence, at the framing of the Constitution, I think the agreement was that the South could continue to import slaves as property until the year 1808, and after that, they were going to have to pay a fine for doing so. And I remember talking about this years ago with a friend of mine. We kind of thought maybe the Founding Fathers would imagine that the issue surrounding slavery would kind of work itself out once you were no longer to buy people as property. Unfortunately, that's not the way that it happened, and this would seriously cause rift between the North and the South, because in the North, they were free, and in the South, they were slaves. And adding to that, I'm sure, was the abolitionist movement with people like Harriet Tubman, who was an escaped slave, and then she would make at least 13 missions back into the South to help other slaves escape to the North and even Canada via the Underground Railroad. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed by Congress, which would require that slaves had to be returned to their owners regardless of the fact that they lived in a free state. Now, what this did was, even if they were freedmen, had lived in the North their whole life, a Southerner could come in and say, no, that's my slave. That is messed up. This would mean that the federal government was responsible for finding and returning all escaping slaves, and like I said, even people who were never slaves. It really was an act of courage that could cost you your life were you found to be a part of the Underground Railroad or an escaping slave. And the fact that people would put themselves on the line like that to save another human being speaks to the courage of Harriet Tubman and all the others who participated in the Underground Railroad. So in 1860, Abraham Lincoln would be elected the 16th President of the United States. Lincoln himself was actually born February 12, 1809, in a log cabin in Kentucky. He was raised in Indiana. History states that he was self-educated. He would go on to become a lawyer and a Whig Party leader. He would also serve as an Illinois state legislator, from 1834 to 1842, and then would serve as a congressman for the state of Illinois from 1847 to 1849, after which he would return to his law practice, which is the way that it should be. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, thus allowing expansion into the West, having slaves, which Lincoln did not agree with. This act would have him re-enter into politics and become the leader of the new Republican Party. The Dred Scott v. Sanford case in 1857 would further solidify Lincoln's stance on abolishing the expansion of slavery into the West. In that case, Dred Scott was a slave whose master had brought him into the free territory under the Missouri Compromise. And upon returning to slave states, Scott would file a petition for his freedom and fight all the way to the United States Supreme Court, where Justice Robert B. Taney would argue that, quote, Negroes were not a part of the body politique, end quote. And he would establish that the Constitution believed that only the U.S. Congress could grant citizenship to people. He would go on to state that Black people were not citizens and had no rights under the United States Constitution. The decision of the High Court would cause some Southern Democrats to hope that this case would settle the issue of slavery once and for all, but it sparked further outrage over that practice in the North. Abraham Lincoln would denounce the decision, saying that he felt that the Founding Fathers may not have believed that all men were created equal in every respect, but they did believe that all men were created equal in certain inalienable rights, among those being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Lincoln would go on to win the Republican nomination for the presidency, and Hannibal Hamlin of Maine, a former Democrat, would be nominated vice president to balance the ticket. So as I stated, this ticket would go on to win the White House in 1860. This would ignite a serious chain of events. South Carolina would be the first state to secede from the Union on December 20th, 1860. By February 1st, 1861, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas would follow. They would then create the Confederate States of America and select Jefferson Davis as the provisional president on February 9th, 1861. President Buchanan and President-elect Lincoln each refused to recognize the new Confederate states. They stated secession was illegal. At his first inaugural address on March 4th, 1861, Lincoln would primarily direct his speech to the southern states, stating that he had no intention to abolish slavery there. In fact, Lincoln would support the Corwin Amendment to the Constitution, which had passed the Congress and was waiting ratification by the states upon Lincoln taking office. This amendment would have protected slavery in the states where it already existed. Can you imagine if that had actually passed? The thought makes me ill. Lincoln would state that he had plans to ban slavery in expanding states, but not in the existing states. This would just add more fuel to the fire when he stated, "One section of our country believes slavery is right and ought to be extended, while the other believes it is wrong and ought not to be extended. This is the only substantial dispute." He would end his first inaugural address with the following: We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. On April 12th, 1861, Confederate forces would open fire on a ship bringing supplies to Fort Sumter upon the request of Major Robert Anderson. The South would see this as an act of war as opposed to a provisional refill, and thus would start the Civil War. So there are many names for the Civil War, right? The common name is the American Civil War. Modern usage in America is simply the Civil War. Other terms were the war between the states, used mainly in the southern states. War of the Rebellion or the Great Rebellion were terms used by northern historians during and immediately after the war. The War for Southern Independence, a Confederate term. The Slaveholders' Rebellion, which was coined by Frederick Douglass. And of course, the War of Northern Aggression, which came about in the 20th century by Southern history revisionists in an attempt to revise the Civil War narrative to negatively portray the northern states and to preserve the Confederate legacy. Remember, the Surratts were living in Maryland, which would remain a part of the Union. They were Confederate sympathizers, and they would host fellow sympathizers at their tavern. And the tavern would even be used as a safe house for Confederate spies. It is rumored that Mary Surratt had knowledge of all of this. The eldest Surratt, Isaac, would eventually leave Maryland on March 7th, 1861, and he would head to Texas, where he would enlist in the Confederate States Army, serving in the 33rd Cavalry. John Jr. would leave St. Charles College in July of that same year and become a courier for the Confederate Secret Service, where he would move messages, cash, and other contraband across enemy lines. All of this, as well as other Confederate activities in and around Surrattsville, would draw the attention of the Union and led to Lafayette C. Baker, a detective with Union Intelligence Service, to have 300 Union soldiers camp in Surrattsville to investigate the Surratts and others. While Baker discovered the courier network and arrested many, the network would survive and remain intact. On August 26, 1862, 1 year after the war began, John Surratt Sr. would collapse and suddenly die of a stroke. The Surratts were already in serious financial trouble. This would cause John Jr. and his sister Anna to help their mother run the family's remaining farmland and businesses. John Jr. would go on to become the postmaster in Surrattsville on September 10th, 1862. Lafayette Baker would return to Surrattsville. He would dismiss several postmasters for disloyalty to the Union, but John Jr. was not one of them. John Jr. would then seek a job in the Paymaster's Department of the United States Department of War in August of 1863, and his application would cause agents to be suspicious about his family's loyalty to the Union. And this would lead to his dismissal as postmaster on November 17, 1863, for disloyalty, which would cause a financial crisis for the Surratt family. At the time of John Sr.'s death, the family owned, they said, only 2 middle-aged male slaves. In 1863, a man by the name of Louis J. Weichman, who attended school with John Jr., noticed that the family had 6 or more slaves working on the property. Remember his name. It's gonna come later. In 1864, Mary would find that her husband's unpaid debts and deplorable business practices were too much and left her far too many creditors. Several of her slaves had run away, and John Jr. would start selling vegetables in order to raise cash for the family when he was not meeting with fellow Confederate sympathizers. Mary would grow tired of running the farm, the tavern, and other businesses without the aid of John Jr., and would start to consider moving to the townhouse that they owned in Washington, D.C. by the fall of 1864. On October 1st, 1864, Mary would actually take possession of the townhouse in D.C. And I have to set up the townhouse, so bear with me. On the first floor were 2 large rooms that were used as a kitchen and a dining area. The second floor had a front and back parlor, but also a room further toward the rear, which Mary would use as a bedroom. The third floor contained 3 rooms, 2 in the front and a larger one toward the back, and the fourth floor, or the attic, which had 2 large rooms and 1 small one, which was allegedly occupied by a servant. Mary would begin moving her belongings into the townhouse that October, and then would be visited by John Jr. and her daughter Anna on November 1st. By December 1st, 1864, Mary had moved herself completely into the townhouse, and on that same day would lease the Surrattsville Tavern to a former Washington, D.C. policeman and Confederate sympathizer, John M. Lloyd, for $500 a year. Mary would convert the 3rd and 4th floors of the townhouse into a boarding house so that she could earn money, which she needed. She would advertise for lodgers in the daily Evening Star paper, after initially stating that she only wanted lodgers that she either personally knew or that were recommended by friends. But in her advertisements, she would state that she had rooms available for gentlemen. Mary, you sly dog. In part 3, we're going to get into the mystery part of Mary Surratt. Like I said, some fact, some myth, but there are historians and scholars that have questioned why she moved into the city, citing that while there was no definitive proof of a conspiracy that took place, a case could be made that she moved there with her children to further the espionage activities of both her and her son, John. So, I hope you will join me for part 3. Don't forget to like this video if it was interesting to you. If you're not subscribed, why not? I will see you in part 3, where we're going to discuss the conspiracy to kidnap Abraham Lincoln. Hello and welcome back. It's Miss History and part 3 of the Mary Surrat Series. If you've missed the first 2 episodes, I will link them in the description box below. When last we left in episode 2, Mary had taken possession of the townhouse in D.C. in October of 1864, and she converted the 3rd and 4th floors to be a boarding house. She rented out the tavern and inn in Surrattsville for $500 a year to a fellow Confederate sympathizer by the name of John Lloyd. Questions would arise as to why she chose to move to the city, with some scholars thinking maybe it was to further the espionage activities of her and her son, John Jr. Louis Weichman claimed the family plans to move became more urgent on account of certain events having turned up. A move to the city made little economic sense in the short term as Mary didn't have much money, but it would make more long-term sense economically because she didn't have the burden of the tavern and the farm. So historians question the real reason why she made the move, with none having a solid answer. Some feel it would have made more economic sense to just rent out the townhouse and collect income there. Like I said, the case can be made that she moved there to further the activities of her and her son for the Confederacy. Lewis Weichman would move into the boarding house on November 1st, 1864. Weichman was a former schoolmate of John Jr., and he would say of John Jr. that he was a persistent rebel, often singing secession songs. John and Weichman would maintain their friendship ever since leaving school in 1862, and while Weichman enjoyed success by landing appointments teaching, John wouldn't fare as well. Weichman would try to get John a position tutoring at Borromeo College near Baltimore, where he worked, but that didn't work out. Further, Weichman would notice a change in his friend, going from dreams of either priesthood, teaching, or farming to that of joining the rebel service. Weichman would be the first board at the new boarding house of Mary upon her moving in, and would actually say that he was honored at the invitation to do so when he learned of Mary's decision to lease the tavern in Surrattsville, as he enjoyed her company as well as that of her daughter, Anna. Weichman would be the one that drew up the papers for the lease on the property in Surrattsville to John Lloyd, which would relieve Mary of a substantial physical and financial burden, and also allowing her to be out of the constant surveillance of the federal Union detectives. The lease of the tavern to Lloyd would mean that it would remain a vital link among the Confederate Secret Service, their courier routes, as an added bonus. If Lloyd were to be caught conducting rebel business, then Mary would be out a paying renter, but not her property. Whether or not this was a larger conspiracy on Mary's part to continue in secret rebel business is up for debate among historians. So one night, Weichman and John Jr. would be out on 7th Street in D.C., December 23rd, 1864. They were reportedly shopping for Christmas, and they would run into Dr. Samuel Mudd, a doctor that had known the Surratts since the 1850s. Samuel was with a man named John Wilkes Booth, who Weichman would later recall was introduced to him as Mr. Boone, and was told that he wanted to purchase Samuel's farm, which wasn't for sale. This chance meeting was actually not by chance at all, as both Mudd and Booth were set to have a meeting with John Jr. It was after this meeting when Booth would become a frequent visitor and resident of the boarding house. Rumor has it that sometimes those visits would be at the request of Mary herself. This was the start of the relationship between Booth, Mary, and her son John. But who was John Wilkes Booth? Well, John Wilkes Booth was the 9th of 10 children born to his father, British Shakespearean actor Junius Brutus Booth, and his mistress, Mary Ann Holmes. Junius and Mary would move to the U.S. from England in June of 1821 and purchase a 150-acre farm near Bel Air, Maryland. Booth was born in the 4-room log home on May 10, 1838. Junius's wife would file for divorce and be granted a divorce on the grounds of adultery in 1851, allowing Junius and Mary to wed, allegedly on May 10th of the same year. Junius would then build Tudor Hall as the family's summer home in 1851 and also maintained a winter residence on Exeter Street in Baltimore. Fancy. Booth was an athletic and popular child, a skilled horseman, and a fencer while he attended the Bel Air Academy. He was described by the headmaster of the school as, quote, not deficient in intelligence, but disinclined to take advantage of the educational opportunities offered him. Each day he rode back and forth from the farm to school, taking more interest in what happened along the way than in reaching his classes on time. That sounds like me in high school. Booth would also attend the Quaker-run Milton Boarding School for Boys in Sparks, Maryland, and St. Timothy's Hall, an Episcopalian military academy in Catonsville, Maryland. He would leave school at the age of 14 after his father's death in November of 1852. At the age of 16, Booth would become interested in theater and politics, and then would aspire to follow in the footsteps of his father and begin studying Shakespeare. He would make his debut on stage at the age of 17 as a supporting role in Richard III at Charles Street Theater in Baltimore, where he was heckled by the audience when he missed some of his lines. He would also do acting at Holiday Street Theater in Baltimore, as well as joining a stock company at the Ark Street Theater in Philadelphia, where he adopted the stage name of J.B. Wilkes. Jim Bishop said of Booth, quote, he developed into an outrageous scene stealer, but he played his parts with such heightened enthusiasm that the audiences idolized him. In 1858, he became a stock company actor at the Richmond Theater in Richmond, Virginia, with his older brother Edwin, where he would become very popular. So it was here in Richmond where Booth would gain all of the accolades and adoration he so desired as an actor. By the close of the 1850s, he was becoming actually quite wealthy as an actor, earning $20,000 a year, which would be roughly $749,476 in 2022, which still seems less than what most actors get paid today. But it would be his time in Richmond that would really deepen his pro-South and pro-slavery position. By the time that Lincoln had re-entered politics and was running for president, Booth was very pro-South, and he hated Lincoln and the Republican Party. Booth would become a lead actor in the 1860s and appear in New York, Boston, Chicago, Cleveland, St. Louis, Columbus, Georgia, Montgomery, Alabama, and New Orleans. When the Civil War started in 1861, he was in Albany, New York, where he was outspoken for secession of the southern states, calling it heroic. His public statements would have the locals demand his banishment from the stage in New York. He would continue his acting career, even in the North, but mostly around the border states at first. He would eventually end up back in Boston as well as New York. He would continue to appear in plays until 1865. And we're back. So anyway, we're talking about John Wilkes Booth. The money that he would make acting would allow him to help finance the Confederate cause financially. It would also allow him to travel with absolutely no suspicion as he supported Confederate espionage. He would further add to his finances with various business ventures, one of which was Fuller Farm Oil, which at the time produced 25 barrels of crude oil a day from a well named Wilhelmina. He would withdraw from the oil business in 1864 at a loss of his $6,000 investment, which would be quite a lot of money today. So, when the war started, Maryland actually voted against secession, but it also voted not to allow federal troops to pass through the state to Virginia and asked President Lincoln to withdraw the troops already there, which would have made the war with the South more difficult and left D.C. exposed, which may have been the Maryland legislators' full intention anyway. This would prompt Lincoln to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, and he would impose martial law in Baltimore as well as other areas of the state. He would further order that many of Maryland's political leaders be imprisoned, and he stationed federal troops in Baltimore. Fellow Maryland Supreme Court Justice Roger B. Taney would argue that Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus was unconstitutional, which many in Maryland, including Booth, would agree with. And it shouldn't be surprising that Taney would argue this, as he's the one that ruled in the Dred Scott case that he didn't believe that black people were considered part of the body politique. All of this would have Booth absolutely seething in more and more hatred for the Union and Lincoln. So, Booth would start to plot the kidnapping of Lincoln in 1864, as it appeared the South was waning in the fight. He felt the only way that the Confederacy would win would be to deal a blow to the Union from the steps of the White House. Thus, he planned to kidnap Lincoln from his summer residence at the Old Soldiers' Home in Washington, D.C., take him across the Potomac and into Richmond, Virginia, the then capital of the Confederacy, and hold him there in exchange for the release of Confederate Army prisoners of war being held in the North. Booth believed that this might also end the war and force the Union to recognize the Confederate government. For this task, Booth would recruit his friends Samuel Arnold and Michael O'Laughlin, and the three would often meet at the home of Maggie Branson at 16 North Utah Street in Baltimore. Booth would also meet several Confederate sympathizers at the Parker House in Boston. In October of 1864, Booth would travel to Montreal, Canada, and set up a bank account to channel funds for the kidnapping plot. The Confederate secret mail system had been using Canadian banks to fund activities set to frustrate the Union during the war. The Union knew about the system, and it was a frustration to them, mostly because they could never ever really find any one person who was involved in the espionage. Aside from that, it was a 2-week turnaround trip from Richmond, Virginia to Montreal, Canada, where couriers would take ciphered letters and miniature photos, often hidden in shoes, buttons, clothing, and other nondescript items, which that allowed them to communicate with top Confederate officials. The most traveled route for this activity led through Surrattsville and D.C. Mary owned property in both locations, and it was believed that her boarding house was the perfect cover for rebel activities. Who would question a widow trying to earn a living in the city? Her boarding house was alleged to be a safe place where private conversations were kept and sympathizers to the South were embraced. So, Lincoln would go on to win re-election in November of 1864 with a platform to outright abolish slavery with an amendment to the Constitution. And this would move Booth to devote more resources into his kidnapping plot. He would recruit, with the help of John Jr., David Harold, George Asderot, Lewis Powell, aka Lewis Payne. I will use those names interchangeably because it depends on what I'm looking at. They would also be recruited. Powell, Payne, depending on which account you're looking at, was a Confederate soldier who had previously been released by the Union after being held as a prisoner of war. Obviously, he had problems. John Jr. was one of the earliest to be pulled into the plot, and as stated, he would find George and David, who he knew to be trustworthy sympathizers to the rebel cause. All of the men would meet regularly at Mary's boarding house. Booth would then pay for lodging and feeding his fellow conspirators, and he would also purchase supplies such as horses, guns, and other items that were going to be needed to carry out the kidnapping plot. Mary would be introduced to John Booth in January of 1865, and the two would quickly develop a very close bond. Mary, also a rebel sympathizer, provided shelter for spies and couriers in need. She also shared Booth's hatred of Lincoln, the Republican Party, abolitionists, and the abolishing of slavery. Having grown up in southern Maryland, Mary, too, was familiar with the terrain and the people of the area, having learned through her husband and later her son, John Jr., who could be trusted and who could be called upon in secret, as well as those who would have financial or physical resources that might be needed and provided without question. It would seem that Booth would speak to Mary daily, often for hours, when John was not at the home, which was frequently due to his role in the Confederate courier network. In March of 1865, John, George, and David would hide 2 Spencer carbines, ammunition, and other supplies at the Surratt Tavern in Surrattsville. So it would appear that the plan was about to fall into place when on March 16th, the president made plans to travel to the country for the day. John Jr., a skilled horseman, would be the lead rider for the day. His job was to lead the charge of chasing down Lincoln's carriage and taking the reins from the driver. The others involved were to take positions at various points along the route traveled by the president, while others would be along the escape route to Richmond. Everything was set, but then fell apart when Lincoln changed his plans and opted to stay in the city that day. So this would lead the conspirators to believe that they had lost the only chance they had, and, having exhausted his funds, Booth, along with the rest of the group, would part ways and find other opportunities, with John Jr. returning to his role as a rebel courier. Booth would take to the bottle quite heavily, but didn't give up his hope of avenging the South and devised a new plot to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. The thing about this case that I find so interesting is the history all surrounding it. Like, did you know that in the early years of U.S. presidents, they didn't have a security detail? In fact, the Secret Service was started in 1865 after the Civil War as the Bureau of the Treasury Department to combat the widespread counterfeiting that was happening at the time. They would not be assigned to presidential security detail until the assassination of President William McKinley in 1901. Prior to the Secret Service, the presidents were sometimes protected by the army or local police. Did you know any of that? Now you do. The more you know. So I'm working on the next part, and I hope that you will join me for it. Don't forget to like, comment what you think, subscribe, and I will see you in the next part where we will discuss Booth's further conspiracy plans, and was Mary really a co-conspirator or just some poor old widow who was caught in the middle of it all? See you next time. Bye. Hello and welcome back. It's Miss History and part 4 of the Mary Surrat series. And if you've missed the first 3, I will link them in the description below. So when last we left, John Wilkes Booth and his merry gang of ragtag conspirators failed to kidnap President Lincoln, which Booth had been planning since 1864. So then they broke up, and Booth would devise a new plan, the assassination of President Lincoln. So the assassination I'm going to do in a couple of different parts, because there's this whole timeline of everybody that's involved in it, including Mary. And so we're going to go ahead and get started with the timeline of events of everyone involved in the conspiracy to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. So prior to Booth's plot to kidnap Lincoln, he was actually arrested in 1863 in St. Louis while on a theater tour after he was heard making the statement that he, quote, wished the president and the whole damned government would go to hell. He would be charged with making treasonous remarks, but would be released after taking an oath of allegiance to the Union and then paying a fine. Obviously, he would not seriously pledge allegiance to the Union, and the payment of the fine meant nothing because he still hated President Lincoln, the Republican Party, and the Union. So, in early 1865, Booth became secretly engaged to a woman by the name of Lucy Lambert Hale, who was the daughter of U.S. Senator John P. Hale. The engagement would be approved by her mother, and she would write to Booth, Lucy's mother, quote, "You have so often been dead in love. Be well assured she is really and truly devoted to you." Lucy had no idea of what Booth was feeling toward Lincoln. Like I said, in 1864, Lincoln would win his second term, and it wasn't long after that that Booth and his older brother Edwin would end up having a falling out, as Edwin was very pro-Union. Edwin would tell Booth that he was no longer welcome at his home. Booth would then argue with his sister Asia, saying about Lincoln, quote, "That man's appearance, his pedigree, his coarse, low jokes and anecdotes, his vulgar smiles, and his policy are a disgrace to the seat he holds. He is made the tool of the North to crush out slavery." Asia would say that Booth went on wild tirades about the war and Lincoln. Booth would then attend the second inauguration of Lincoln on March 4th, 1865, with his secret fiancée, Lucy. He would later say that he had the perfect chance to have assassinated Lincoln on that day had he so desired. Booth would learn that Lincoln was to attend a play at a hospital near the soldiers' home and would assemble his team to kidnap the president. But Lincoln changed plans. Booth would learn that the president attended a reception at the National Hotel in Washington that night, the hotel where Booth happened to be staying. Guess you could say lucky for Lincoln, missed opportunity for Booth. In March of 1865, Booth was supposed to play the lead role in The Apostate at Ford's Theater, but this is a role that he would walk away from, as well as his entire acting career. Friends never suspected Booth's inclinations were to assassinate the president. Included in this plot was that Booth would assassinate Lincoln, George Asterod would assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Paine would assassinate Secretary of State William Seward. In fact, that same month, John Jr., Asterod, and David Harold would hide 2 Spencer carbines, ammunition, and other supplies at the tavern in Surrattsville. April 3rd, 1865, Richmond would fall, with Confederate government and remaining military evacuating the city on April 2nd. Those fleeing would destroy bridges, and the last of them headed south, and warehouses on the waterfront were set on fire to keep the remaining supplies from falling into the hands of approaching Union troops. Early in the morning of April 3rd, Union troops would march with bands in front right down Main Street and into the city. As they got closer, they encountered drunken mobs and fires, but it was only the warehouse district that burned. One Union soldier said of it, "The smoke became so thick as to make it impossible to see even a few feet in advance. The scene that met our eyes here almost baffles description. Pandemonium reigned supreme. The street we were in was a one compact masses of frenzied people, and it was only with the greatest difficulty that we were able to force our way along. At length the heat became so great that we could proceed no further. Our hair and beards were scorched, our clothing smoked, the air we breathed was like furnace blast." On a lamppost I read the words 14th Street. So some have claimed that it was the Union that set fire to the warehouses, but it was actually the Union that would put those fires out. John Surratt happened to be in Richmond, but Mary was not aware that he had gotten out prior to Jefferson Davis ordering the evacuation of the city. John had been given $200 in gold in order to deliver it to General Edwin Gray Lee in Montreal. In fact, John left the city the morning of April 1st, while Mary was in Surrattsville for unknown reasons, and would return the same day around supper time in the company of her brother, John Jenkins. On Sunday, April 2nd, still not knowing that John had left the city, Mary would ask boarding house resident Louis Weichman to go to the National Hotel to find Booth and tell him that she needed to speak with him, stating that if he were unable to find Booth, he should find Asterod. Weichman would find Asterod at the Pennsylvania House standing outside with 2 horses, one belonging to Booth, and the 2 would ride to the boarding house, where Asterod would meet with Mary, while Weichman waited outside with the horses. No one knows what the meeting was about. This would be the visit that would mark a drastic escalation in Mary's direct participation in the plot to assassinate the president. After the meeting, Weichman would ride with Asterod to church. Weichman would suspect that Mary's visit to Surrattsville on April 1st was connected in some way to her meeting with Asterod. Later, on the afternoon of April 2nd, Mary would again ask Weichman to go back to the Pennsylvania House to request of Asterod permission for her brother to use one of the horses so that he could ride back to Surrattsville. Weichman would go to make the request, but Asterod would say that he needed permission from Louis Paine. The 2 would then make the request of Paine, which Paine would deny. Weichman would relate this information to Mary, who became angry and told Weichman that she found it very unkind of Asterod, as she had been so kind as to him and even gave him her last $5. While Booth and John Jr. were the ones in charge of the horses, It was curious why suddenly Payne was in charge, but with John out of town and Booth wrapped up in his latest plot, it became apparent that Payne's role was even more important. And though it was risky to say no to Mary, because she was John's mother and the confidant of Booth. On April 3rd, 1865, John Jr. would show up at his mother's boarding house in the early evening. He was unaware that Richmond had fallen and actually did not believe Weichman when Weichman told him, and actually said of the news that it was incorrect, as he had just seen Confederate President Jefferson Davis and Secretary of State Judah Benjamin. He said everything appeared well. John would make a rush to exchange some of his gold for cash with a man named John Houlihan, who was also a resident of the boarding house, and he would again depart for Montreal on the morning of April 4th. It's not known whether or not Booth was present on the evening of the 3rd, but what is certain is that John's obligation to the Confederacy outweighed his obligation to Booth. John felt he was responsible in carrying out his original assignment from Judah Benjamin and would arrive in Montreal to await further instructions from the rebel agents living there. Either John was not part of the assassination plot, or he had not been given a clear role from Booth. Either way, his trip to Montreal would turn out to be a life-saving one. The week after the fall of Richmond in April of 1865 was the Catholic Holy Week, but the events happening in the South were what was really capturing the attention of everyone. General Ulysses S. Grant of the Union would battle General Robert E. Lee of the Confederacy in Virginia, where Lee would finally surrender. In North Carolina, Union General William T. Sherman would chase Confederate rebels and would claim victory in Durham. This would be the official end of the war. However, there would be continued battles and rebellions in some of the South. It is assumed that Confederate President Davis and his staff approved of the original plot to kidnap President Lincoln, but not that there was a new plot to assassinate him. That said, it's also assumed that Jefferson Davis may have been aware of the target on Lincoln's life, as days following the fall of Richmond, a group of rebel soldiers led by Colonel John S. Mosby had devised a plan to slip into Washington and plant explosives in a hidden tunnel under the White House to kill Lincoln as he met with his cabinet. This plot would actually fall apart on April 10th, 1865, when a Union cavalry regiment tracked Mosby's group, fired on them, and captured their explosive expert, Thomas Harney. It's believed that Booth knew of this plot, but that he also believed the plan was the work of the Confederate espionage network in New York. Booth had plans of his own that he hoped to carry out before they could carry theirs out. Booth would attend a speech given by Lincoln on April 11th, 1865, where Lincoln would promote voting rights for black men. This did not sit well with Booth. Also on April 11th, 1865, with John still in Canada, Mary would again ask Weichman to contact Booth so she could borrow his carriage and ask Weichman to come with her to the tavern, stating that she was collecting on a debt owed to her by a former neighbor. Weichman would ask Booth about the buggy, but learned that Booth had sold it. Booth in turn gave Weichman $10 for Mary to rent a buggy for the trip, which she would make. While on the way to Surrattsville, Mary and Weichman would pass another carriage on the way to Washington. It was driven by John Lloyd, the man leasing the tavern. The two carriages would stop. Lloyd would get out of his and come to speak to Mary. Lloyd would say that Mary told him to get the shooting irons ready for pickup, which he had actually forgotten about until she said something. Lloyd would tell Mary that they were hidden away in the far back, as he feared the house and tavern might be searched, as it had been being watched closely. Lloyd would ask Mary about John, as he had heard rumor that soldiers were after him to arrest him for going to Richmond. Mary laughed and stated that if John were able to go to Richmond and back in 6 days without being caught, he must be a very smart man. After the conversation, Wykeman and Mary would continue to Surrattsville, where she planned to meet with John Nothey. When he wasn't there, where she thought he was going to be, she sent word that she needed to meet with him and to come see her at Bennett Gwynn's home. Bennett and his family were rebel sympathizers, with Bennett himself being one of the original witnesses to a mortgage transaction between Nothey and John Sr. in 1852. Mary and Wykeman would stay and have dinner with Bennett and his family, and then go to the tavern where Nothey was waiting. Mary would then go into the parlor area with Bennett and Nothey to take care of whatever business needed done, and then Mary would return to the carriage where Wykeman waited, and the two would return to Washington. In the meantime, John Lloyd would run into George Astorad on his return from Washington and inquire what he should do with the weapons. It's alleged that Astorad told Lloyd to bury them. So, April 14th, 1865 was Good Friday, and Mary would attend Good Friday services at St. Patrick's Church with Wykeman. Wykeman, who worked for the War Department, would then take advantage of getting the day off to observe the day, and then attend additional services at St. Matthew's Church. Wykeman planned to spend the rest of the day reading at the boarding house, but sometime around 2 that afternoon, Mary would again request that Wykeman rent a buggy and accompany her to Surrattsville to presumably collect a debt. Wykeman seemed irritated by her constant requests, but obliged to travel with her due to all of the kindness that she had been showing to him. Wykeman would rent a buggy and prepare to depart on the afternoon of April 14th. Prior to her leaving the boarding house, Booth would pay a visit and have a private meeting with her to give her a package to be delivered to the tavern. It would be a pair of binoculars for Lloyd. It's believed that Mary made the trip for Booth using her business with Nothey as a cover, because Booth needed someone to alert Lloyd to have the items stored at the tavern ready for pickup that evening. Mary was the perfect cover to get the last-minute supplies to the tavern for Booth's escape that evening. It's also believed that Booth told Astorad to visit Lloyd and have him get the guns ready, but Astorad seemed to be getting leery and uncomfortable with the plot, and he did not want to assassinate the vice president. So it's possible that Booth knew he could not trust Astorad, and this is why he asked Mary, his confidant, co-conspirator, and sympathizer, to make the trip with the message and the package. When Mary and Wykeman arrived at the tavern, Nothey was there, he was not there, so they left a note, and Nothey owed her money for land that she had leased to him, but she owed money to another man in D.C. and desperately needed the money from Nothey to settle the debt. So the note that she left at the tavern for Nothey would read, "Mr. Nothey, dear sir, I have this day received a letter from Mr. Calvert intimating me that either you or your friends have represented to him that I am not willing to settle with you for the land. You know that I am ready and have been waiting for these last 2 years. And now, if you do not come within the next 10 days, I will settle with Mr. Calvert and bring suit against you immediately. Mr. Calvert will give you a deed on receiving payments. Mary would give this letter to Bennet Gwyn, who she happened to see, and she would ask him to deliver it to Nothie. But Nothie only lived 3 miles from the tavern, and so it's not known why Mary didn't just have Weichman go the extra distance. Also, Nothie had no idea that Mary was planning a trip to Surrattsville that Good Friday, and so he didn't expect to meet with her. Another thing worth noting was she gave him an additional 10 days to settle the debt, so it seemed a little odd that she would travel all the way to Surrattsville when she could have spent a few cents on postage and mailed the letter to him. Once Mary sent the letter with Bennet, she brought the wrapped package from Booth into the inn and showed it to Lloyd's sister-in-law and then placed it on the sofa in the parlor, stating that she was requested to leave it there. Mary would ask where Lloyd was, as it was 5:30 in the evening and she needed to speak with him privately. Mary was told that he had attended court in Marlborough and he hadn't yet returned. So Mary would wait for a little while until Lloyd pulled up and drove around to the kitchen with fresh fish and oysters for the tavern. While Lloyd was unloading the seafood, Mary, package in hand, walked through the house and out the door to speak with him. Lloyd's sister-in-law heard the parting words of Mary and Lloyd as Mary departed, with Mary saying, "Talk about the devil and his imps will appear." Lloyd would respond, "I was not aware that I was a devil before." Lloyd had been drinking, and in his drunken state, Mary became angry with him because, as we all know, she had issues with drunkenness. Mary would say, "Well, Mr. Lloyd, I want you to have those shooting irons ready. There will be parties here tonight who will call on them." She would then hand him the package from Booth and tell him to have 2 bottles of whiskey ready, as they would also be called for that night. After she delivered the package and the messages to Lloyd, Mary would return to the front of the tavern where Weichman waited and climbed into the buggy for the trip back to D.C. Weichman had just gotten the horse to move when the buggy's front spring bolt snapped and was detached from the axle. So Mary would have to hurry back into the tavern and then request the help of Lloyd in fixing the axle, which he was able to do regardless of his intoxication. Mary was seemingly anxious to get back to the boarding house because she was apparently supposed to be meeting a gentleman. When Weichman asked if that gentleman would be Booth, Mary did not respond one way or another. They would arrive in the city amid a large Union victory celebration as the sun started setting behind them, and Mary stated, "I am afraid all this rejoicing will be turned into mourning and all this glory into sadness." Mary would be dropped off at the boarding house around 8:30 by Weichman, and he would return the horse and buggy to the stable around the corner. Upon his return to the boarding house, he and Mary would have a late supper. Meanwhile, the evening of April 14th, 1865 of Good Friday, would have Booth at Ford's Theater to collect his mail. Booth, having performed at the theater, would have access to every part of the theater. He also had a good relationship with theater owner John T. Ford, which is why his mail was sent there. While there, he would learn from the owner's son that President Lincoln would be in attendance that evening with Ulysses S. Grant and Mrs. Grant to watch the play Our American Cousin. This would spur Booth into action, and he would immediately start to make plans for assassinating the president that evening. Booth made arrangements with the livery stable owner for 2 horses and an escape route out of the city. That evening, Booth would inform his fellow conspirators of his intentions to assassinate Lincoln. Payne was to assassinate William Seward. Astorad was to assassinate Vice President Johnson. Harold would aid in their escape out of the city and into Virginia. According to historian Michael Kaufman, by Booth targeting the president and his two successors, his intention was to decapitate the Union government, thus throwing it into a state of panic. However, in 1865, the second presidential successor would not have been Seward, but rather the president pro tempore of the U.S. Senate, Lafayette S. Foster. Today, that would be the Speaker of the House. The added possibility of assassinating General Grant would have further added to the chaos that would be left in the wake of all of it. That evening, while having dinner with Weichman, Mary would answer a knock at the second floor main entrance around 9 p.m. Weichman heard the front door open and footsteps move into the parlor area. He could not hear the conversation, and the visitor only stayed for a few minutes before departing, but he believed that the visitor was Booth on his final visit for that day. Boarding house resident Eliza Houlihan was waiting for Mary so that the two could attend the Good Friday evening mass. It would be 9:15 p.m. when Mary agreed to go, regardless of the fact that mass had started 2 hours prior. Mary would put on a large bonnet and grab her shawl, and the two ladies would leave to attend the service. As they proceeded down the street, only a short distance, they decided to return to the boarding house. The women would pause at the top of the stairs before going back into the house in the light drizzle of rain that had started to fall. Richard Smoot would come to the boarding house to see John Jr. at around 9:30, and he noticed a woman standing on the porch, her face hidden by a large bonnet, so he couldn't see who it was. But as he started to climb the stairs, she quickly went inside and then suddenly turned around, asking who was there. Smoot announced himself and asked if John had returned yet. Mary said she thought the boat would be used that night and that Smoot would get his money in a day or two. Mary would then rush him out of the doorway, telling him to leave the city and not be seen at her house again. This would cause Smoot to become alarmed, as he felt something significant was about to happen and he wanted no part of it. Due to the late hour, he knew that he would likely not be able to get out of the city and into Maryland, as the last public coach going over the Long Bridge into southern Maryland left at 10. He decided to take his chances and rush to catch the coach, but he was late, so he walked to Alexandria, where he stayed for the night and would catch the first coach in the morning. Mary would be in the parlor on the second floor with residents Anna, Eliza, and Nora, and they would later be joined by Weichman. Mary seemed agitated and irritable, but when asked what was wrong, she simply said she was very nervous and did not feel well. There was a torchlight procession, and Mary would ask Weichman where it was going, and was told that they were headed to the White House to serenade the president. Suddenly and unexpectedly, Mary asked Weichman to pray for her intentions. This is common in Catholicism, where fellow practitioners are sometimes asked to pray for each other's intentions, i.e., to pray for what they had done or what they were planning to do, to pray that it is the correct path, and not for their own glory, but for God's glory. When Weichman asked about her intentions, she did not answer him. She just asked again that he pray for her. Weichman, Anna, Olivia, and Nora were laughing and teasing each other in the parlor, but Mary was becoming increasingly tense, which the playful banter of her guests was not helping. Eventually, Mary would yell at them, thus causing them to retreat to their rooms for the rest of the evening. The plot to assassinate the 16th President of the United States had many moving parts and many people involved. Be working on the details surrounding the actions taken by those involved in the assassination plot, and I hope that you will join me for it. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next part where we will discuss the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Hello! Welcome back to Miss History and part 5 of the Mary Surrat series. If you've missed the first 4 episodes, I will link them in the description box below. In part 4, I talked about the timeline of events that would lead to the assassination of Lincoln. This is the rest of this story. You'll remember that Mary had made a couple of trips to Surrattsville, the last believed to be on a mission from Booth to get the last needed supplies to the tavern for the evening of April 14th, 1865. On that final trip, Mary would tell John Lloyd, the tavern renter, to have the shooting irons ready as well as whiskey and the other provisions that had been left at the tavern by the other conspirators. Seriously, I can say words. As stated, Booth had become secretly engaged to a woman named Lucy Hale, and he had attended Lincoln's second inaugural speech with her. On April 11th of 1865, Booth was in a crowd of people listening to an impromptu speech given by Lincoln from his window at the White House. During this speech, Lincoln would come out in favor of granting suffrage to former slaves, which would make Booth angry. I mean, like, he was pissed. And then he would go on to state that that would be the last speech that Lincoln would ever give. Foreshadowing. April 12th, 1865 is when Booth would learn that Robert E. Lee had officially surrendered at the Appomattox Courthouse. It's alleged that Booth then told Lewis Weichman, while at Mary's boarding house, that he had decided to be done with the state and that the only play he wanted to present in the future was Venice Preserved. Weichman didn't understand the reference, and it turns out Venice Preserved is a tragedy that was originally written in the 1680s. It's an English restoration play that was written by Thomas Otway and first appeared on stage in 1682. The premise of the play is that an impoverished yet noble Venetian secretly married the daughter of a proud senator who then cut off her inheritance because of her marriage. Jaffir, the Venetian, resented his father-in-law and convinced his friend Pierre, who was a foreign soldier, to assassinate the senator along with other conspirators. This would be the role of a lifetime for Booth, to be sure. With his plan to kidnap Lincoln unfeasible, the fall of Richmond, and the surrender of Lee, Booth dug into his new goal of assassination. Like I said in part 4, Booth would go and pick up his mail at Ford's Theater on April 14th, 1865, where he learned that Lincoln would be attending the play Our American Cousin that evening, along with General Grant and his wife. He would then make arrangements with a livery stable owner, James Pumphrey. James was an acquaintance of John Jr., who was the one that introduced him to Booth. His stable was located near the National Hotel, where Booth resided at the time. James had one particular horse that Booth preferred, so this was the horse that he requested from James, but he was informed that the horse was unavailable, and so Booth would have to hire a different horse. Booth said that he would pick up that horse in the afternoon around 4 o'clock. 4 o'clock that afternoon, Booth arrived at the stable to pick up the horse and was informed by James that she was high-spirited and would break the halter if unattended. Booth would tell James that he was going to Grover's Theater, which was the former name of the National Theater, to write a letter, after which he was going to have a drink somewhere and then take a leisurely ride. Booth was not completely dishonest with James. It's just that he didn't go to Grover's Theater to write his letter. He wrote it at the National Hotel and addressed it to the editor of the National Intelligencer. In his letter, he would state that his plans to kidnap Lincoln had changed to assassinating him, and he would add the names of his co-conspirators at the end of the letter: Lewis Powell, Payne, George Asderod, and David Harold. I find it odd that he would leave out the names of Mary and John, but perhaps he just wanted to protect his friends. Once his letter was complete, he would get a drink at the Star Saloon, which was located close to Ford's Theater, with some of the stagehands of the theater. Among those was Edmund Spangler, who had earlier that afternoon been asked by theater owner Harry Ford to help prepare the state box for the president's attendance that evening. He would work to bring in furniture and remove a partition between box numbers 7 and 8 to create a larger box for the president and his guests. While getting drinks with the other stagehands and Booth mentioned that he might be back to the theater that evening to attend the performance. That evening, the president, Mrs. Lincoln, and their guests arrived at the theater. General Grant and his wife had declined the president's invitation at the last moment and opted to travel to Burlington, New Jersey to celebrate the end of the war with their children. The president would then extend an invitation to another couple, Miss Clara Harris and her fiance, Major Henry Rathbone. The foursome had settled into the box at the theater and were enjoying the play. Around 9:30 that evening, Booth would appear at the theater, dismount his horse, and ask Spangler to hold his mare due to the work he had to do. Spangler would explain that he would ask another stagehand, Joseph Burroughs, to hold the horse. At some point during the third act, the president and his wife would draw closer together and hold hands. Mary would lean into her husband and whisper, "What will Miss Harris think of my hanging on to you so?" To which the president would smile and say, "She won't think anything about it." The time was around 10:15 p.m. when Booth would enter the box where the president sat and shot President Lincoln in the back of the head with a .41 caliber Derringer pistol while the president held his wife's hand. Booth almost did not escape the presidential box because Major Rathbone lunged at him and was stabbed by Booth. Booth would then jump from the presidential box to the stage, raise his knife in the air, and shout, "Sic semper tyrannis," which is Latin for "thus always to tyrants." There are also accounts that he further added, "I have done it. The South is avenged." And with that, he would run across the stage, exit the theater. There are accounts that he either broke or fractured his leg after catching a spur on one of the flags adorning the stage, but others contend that he may not have due to his quick exit. Although it could be that he was so crazed and in a frenzy, and adrenaline and everything, that what he had just done, maybe he didn't even realize that he had injured his leg. Maybe. At any rate, he would get on his horse and start riding out of D.C., where he would meet up with fellow conspirator David Harold, and the two would bribe their way out of D.C. and into Maryland. They had to bribe their way because guards were informed that no crossings were allowed after 9 p.m. It's after 10. The guards would allow them to pass, and they would then start heading to the tavern in Surrattsville. While all of this is going on, Lewis Payne was at the home of William Seward, who had been injured in a carriage accident and was recovering at home. Seward's servant would answer Payne's knocks, and Payne would pretend to be a messenger from Seward's doctor and tell the servant that he was there to deliver medication to Seward. But the servant was insistent that Seward could have no visitors. Payne would push his way upstairs. Seward's son, Frederick, would intervene outside of his father's bedroom, and Payne would attack him, beating him almost to death with the butt of his pistol. Payne would then burst into Seward's room and be confronted by Seward's daughter, Fanny, and an army private, George Robinson. Payne would attack Robinson, slashing and stabbing him around his head, leaving him immobile, and then focus on his target, William Seward, who laid in a bed. Payne would stab Seward and leave near-fatal wounds around his head and his neck. He had a gun. Anyway, when the commotion of what was happening had other members of the house rushed to the room, Payne fled, but not before attacking Augustus Seward, another son, and Emmerich Hansel on his way out. Due to the chaos of the attacks in the house, it was really easy for him to make a quick escape. Payne was certain that he had been successful in his part of the assassination plot. George Asderod, assigned to assassinate Vice President Johnson, would lose his nerve and spend his evening drinking instead. So, as stated, Booth and Harold had planned an escape route once they bribed their way out of D.C. They would take advantage of the sparsely settled areas along predominantly Confederate sympathies through Maryland. They would arrive at the Surratt's Tavern around midnight, where they collected the supplies waiting for them. They would then continue south toward Virginia, where they stopped before dawn at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd to treat Booth's leg injury. Mudd would later say that he was told that Booth injured his leg when his horse fell on him. So there was a leg injury. We don't know how it happened. Also in those pre-dawn hours, in D.C., Weichman would make a trip to the outhouse in the back of the boarding house. He would return and be startled by the ringing of the front doorbell, and he would quickly pull on pants and leave his shirt open as he stumbled to the door to call out who is there. He was met with the response from Detective James McDevitt from the Metropolitan Police. Detectives come to search the house for John Wilkes Booth and John Surratt. Weichman would inform them that the men were not there, and McDevitt would say, "Let us in anyhow." Yeah, you got a warrant. So this would prompt Weichman to go to the room of Mary and say, "Here, Miss Surratt, are detectives who have come to search the house." Mary would respond from the other side of the door, "For God's sake, let them come in. I expected the house to be searched." Really? The detectives would then enter the house where Weichman, still half dressed and in his stocking feet, would lead them to the parlor. But the detectives would immediately spread throughout the house, searching for both Booth and Surratt. They would enter Weichman's room, search his closet, under his bed. They searched the hall. When Weichman demanded to know why they were searching for Booth and Surratt in the early morning hours, he was met with the response, "Do you pretend to tell me you do not know what happened last night?" Detectives were shocked to learn that Weichman had not heard about the events of the evening of April 14th, and one of them said, "I will tell you." He took a bloody necktie from his pocket, so much for preserving evidence in 1865, showed it to Weichman saying, "Do you see this blood? That is Abraham Lincoln's blood. John Wilkes Booth has murdered Abraham Lincoln, and John Surratt has assassinated the Secretary of State." Detectives were not yet aware that it was Seward who had survived his attack and that it was Payne and not Surratt who was responsible. Weichman was asked if he had been in the boarding house all evening the night before, and he was really honest and said that no, he hadn't been, that he had gone with Mary to Surrattsville earlier in the day and returned to the house around 8:30 that night. This is when things started to become very clear to Weichman. The many visits, secret meetings, weapons, strange men coming and going, other seemingly insignificant events were now more clear and confirmed more than he imagined. Weichman would then say aloud, "Great God, I see it all. I see it all now." I'm sure he felt used and very much kind of like a pawn when he realized all of the things that he had seen and heard were Booth planning to kill the president, which President Lincoln would die at 7:52 on the morning of April 15th, 1865. Detectives would search the rest of the home, with Weichman following them to the second floor and the room of Mary. Detectives would note that Mary had changed her clothes while they were searching the rest of the house. As the detectives Clairvaux and McDevitt spoke, Weichman would approach Mary and say, "What do you think, Mrs. Surratt? President Lincoln has been murdered by John Wilkes Booth, and the Secretary of State has been assassinated." Mary would appear shocked at the news when Detective Clairvaux would ask, "Mrs. Surratt, I want to ask you a couple of questions, and be particular how you answer them, for there is a great deal that depends on them. When did you last see John Wilkes Booth?" She stated that she had last seen Booth at 2 o'clock on the afternoon of April 14th. Clairvaux then asked, "When did you see your son last, and where is he?" Mary said that she hadn't seen her son in 2 weeks, and that she thought he was in Canada as she had received a letter from him postmarked Montreal. However, when asked to produce the letter, she said she couldn't find it. This would then prompt Mary to become irritated and defensive, demanding to know what was going on and reminding officers that there were many mothers who had no idea where their sons were. What was weird was that John's on and off girlfriend and border house resident Anna had a packet of letters from John, but Mary, who always seemed concerned about her son and his whereabouts, would misplace her most recent correspondence from him. Maybe she was hiding something. Detectives were unable to find Booth or Surratt in the house or any other suspicious people, and then they would leave. Anna would scream out to Mary, "Oh, Ma, just think of it. That man having been here in the house before the assassination. I am afraid that it will bring suspicion upon us all." To which Mary would respond, "Anna, come what will, I am resigned. I think John Wilkes Booth was only an instrument in the hands of the Almighty to punish this proud and licentious people." Weichman would be unable to sleep for the rest of the evening and early morning, and he would begin replaying the events of the past several months in his head. The secret meetings, the conversations, the strange people visiting and staying at the house, John's frequent absences, the unaccounted for gold that John had, Booth's frequent presence. He would become convinced that John could not have been the one to attack Seward, as he had seen the letter from John to Mary, though he did not read it. But this would have him wonder why Mary would not provide proof of her son being elsewhere and could not have been involved in the events of the evening before. Around 5 o'clock that morning, Weichman would dress and go to Howard's stables on G Street, where he would discuss his suspicions with Brooke Stabler. Convinced that it was not John who attacked Seward, but Astorad, who to Weichman seemed more like a person who would commit such crime. On his walk back to the house, he ran into fellow boarder John Houlihan, who confided to Weichman that he too had been suspicious of all the happenings at the house over the past several months. The two would agree to find McDevitt at the police station and tell him of their suspicions. Before that, they would have breakfast at the boarding house and catch up on the latest news of the prior evening's events. It was in reading the news that Weichman would get the description of Seward's attacker, and he was described as larger than John. This did not absolve John in Weichman's mind, but he wondered what part, if any, John had in Booth's larger plan, and if he knew what Booth was planning. How did the detectives know to search the boarding house? What could a widow, mother, businesswoman, devout Catholic have to do with such an insidious plot? With so many characters, so many moving parts, so much history, this has been a very interesting series for me, and I hope for you as well. In the next part, we'll discuss Booth's further escape and the arrests of the co-conspirators, including Mary. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in part 6. Bye. Hello, and welcome back to Miss History and part 6 of the Mary Surrat series. And if you've missed the first 5, I'll put them in the description. I'll put a link up here. And you can catch up if you want, or if you don't want to and you just want to watch this one, that's fine too. Because in part 5, I talked about all of the roles of those involved in the conspiracy to assassinate Lincoln, questioned how the police knew to search Mary's boarding house, and more importantly, why did Mary expect the house to be searched in the early morning hours of April 15th, 1865? And now we continue with the escape of Booth and the arrests of those involved. So, if you'll remember in the last episode, right, Booth assassinates Lincoln, escapes the theater, starts riding out of town toward Virginia. He would catch up with David Harold, and the two would bribe their way out of D.C. on the night of the assassination. They would arrive at the tavern in Surrattsville to collect the items left there during the kidnapping plot, and then they would head south again. And in the early morning hours of April 15th, 1865, the two would stop at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd for treatment of Booth's leg, and then they would continue south toward Virginia. April 15th, 1865, Booth and Harold would arrive at the home of Samuel Cox in the early morning hours, where they would hide in the woods nearby. Cox would then contact his foster brother, Thomas A. Jones, who was a Confederate agent in charge of spy operations in southern Maryland. So then Booth would continue to hide out in the woods until he could safely cross the Potomac into Virginia, because the War Department had advertised a $100,000 reward for any information that would lead to the arrest of Booth and his co-conspirators. Federal troops would search the rural area, woods, and swamps in the days following the assassination of Lincoln. On April 18th, 1865, mourners would wait in long lines to view the slain president as his body lay in state. The nation would come together to mourn and be present for the funeral of Lincoln, even sleeping on blankets on the Capitol building lawns. Frederick Douglass would call the assassination an unspeakable calamity. Newspapers would call Booth an accursed devil, monster, madman, and wretched fiend. Whatever happened to language? People in the North who had photos of Booth from his stage days would throw them out, burn them, crumble up the photos, whatever, just to get rid of them. And even in the South, there would be sorrow about the death of Lincoln. The mayor and city council in Savannah, Georgia, would address a crowd and express their indignation. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnson would call Booth's act a disgrace to the age, and Robert E. Lee would also express his regret of Lincoln's death at the hands of Booth. The grief wasn't everywhere, and a man in New York City actually got attacked for saying it served old Abe right. In the South, Lincoln was hated as much in death as he was in life, and Booth, in some areas, was viewed as a hero. Booth would continue to hide out in Maryland, and then he would read accounts of all of the nationwide mourning that was being reported in the newspapers that were being brought to him by Jones. On April 20th, 1865, he knew of the arrests of his co-conspirators, which we'll cover next episode, including Mary, Powell, Arnold, and O'Laughlin, and he would be surprised to find very little public sympathy for what he had done, even from anti-Lincoln newspapers. In the San Francisco Chronicle, it was written, Booth has simply carried out what secession politicians and journalists have been for years expressing in words, who have denounced the president as a tyrant, a despot, and a usurper, hinted at and virtually recommended. Many would blame the critics of Lincoln for Booth's attack. On April 21st, 1865, Booth would write in his journal, For 6 months we worked to capture, but our cause being almost lost, something decisive and great must be done. I struck boldly, and not as the papers say. I can never repent it, though we hated to kill. I don't think you did, Booth. Crazy man. That same day, April 21st, a 9-car funeral train with Lincoln's body would depart Washington, D.C. en route to Springfield, Illinois. The train would have stops in Harrisburg. The train would stop in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania at 8:20 p.m. And around that same time, Booth and Harold were given a boat and a compass by Jones to cross the Potomac into Virginia. Before they got on the boat to cross the river, they would kill their horses, including the one that Booth would rent from Pumphrey. Guess he's not getting his money back, or his horse, as they were no longer needed. However, instead of going to Virginia, the pair would take a wrong turn at a bend in the river and end up back in Maryland on April 22nd. But as it turns out, Harold would know the area recognize a farm that belonged to a known Confederate sympathizer who would bring them to his son-in-law, Colonel John J. Hughes. Hughes would give them food and allow them a place to stay until nightfall, when they would again cross the river. Booth would write in his journal, "With every man's hand against me, I am here in despair. And why? For doing what Brutus was honored for, and yet I, for striking down a greater tyrant that they ever knew, am looked upon as a common cutthroat." Yes, yes, you were. Booth and Harold would make it to Virginia in the pre-dawn hours of April 23rd, 1865, where they would make contact with Thomas Harbin. Harbin would take them to another Confederate agent, William Bryant, who then would give them fresh horses. So we come back to the question of how the agents knew to search Mary's boarding house. And it has been concluded by historians that it was maybe a Department of War employee, Daniel Gleason, and a friend of Weichman, who alerted the federal authorities of the Confederate activities at the Surratt house. However, another historian, Roy Chamley, disagrees, saying that there is evidence that Gleason didn't tell the police about his suspicions of Weichman for like several days. So, you remember Weichman and Houlihan deciding to go to Detective McDevitt. On the morning of April 15th, 1865, Weichman would announce that he was going to go to the police and tell them everything he knew about Booth, though he wasn't exactly sure what he did know. And he would mention to Mary and the others at the house that there was bound to be further investigation of the house and the residence. So Anna would tell Weichman to stop talking, and that as far as she was concerned, Lincoln was no worse than the meanest, can't say that word on YouTube, in the army. Weichman would say later that he told her she would soon find out differently. Early in the investigation, eyewitness testimony and other pieces of evidence since the night of the assassination would link Booth and his conspirators to Mary's boarding house. Shocking. There would be an uncoordinated effort between the Union Army and the Washington Metropolitan Police, which would prevent organization of data and would make for a less effective coordination and analysis of the evidence because, nobody wants to share. That said, both agencies would see a pattern linking the events of April 14th, 1865 with John Jr., who both agencies would have files on due to his rebel courier activities. However, it would be the disorganization and competition between the agencies that would create several delays on many fronts and eventually lead to a loss of evidence. These delays could probably have given Mary time to hide or destroy any evidence of her or John's part in the conspiracy. Federal soldiers would again go to the boarding house late on April 17th, 1865, based on information given by Weichman, Houlihan, and that of a recently hired servant, Susan Jackson. Susan would tell Provost Marshal Henry H. Wells, the commander of an Army investigative unit, that 3 mysterious men had come to the boarding house after the assassination and that there were whispers that John Jr. was with Booth at the theater. The men would then get in a buggy after one had changed clothes and they left. Susan was likely scared, confused, or absolutely misunderstood what was happening, as she was mistaken about the date where the 3 men that she heard were actually Weichman, Houlihan, and Detective McDevitt when McDevitt came to the home late on the morning hours of April 15th to meet with Weichman and Houlihan. Unfortunately for Mary, this was a big deal, as Susan's statements would have the government officials now not only suspecting John Jr. of being involved, but Mary as well. Weichman would give long statements about what he had seen over the past several months and would identify not only Booth, but also David Harold, George Asderot, Lewis Powell, Dr. Samuel Mudd, and John Jr. He was not yet able to accept that Mary may have been a part of the plot as well. In his statements and affidavits, he would say that Mary welcoming Booth was unfortunate and actually disrupted the normally pleasant home. It would be a period of time before Weichman would connect the events and ultimately expose Mary as one of the important fellow conspirators of Booth. Based on the statements given by Susan and the other evidence, Colonel Wells would command a detail of armed guards and officers to the boarding house on April 17th, 1865, with orders to arrest Mary Surratt and anyone else in the house with her. Armed officers and guards would surround the boarding house on H Street, and shortly before 11 that evening, 5 officers would climb the stairs and knock on the door, led by Eli DeVore. An open window with a curtain blocking it would lead the officers to hear Mary ask, "Is that you, Mr. Kirby?" To which DeVore would reply, "No, madam, I want this door opened," while another officer would write down the name Kirby, which is a new name. Upon entering the house, DeVore would notice that Mary seemed calm as she identified herself as the widow of John H. Surratt Sr. and the mother of John H. Surratt Jr., and she did not seem at all surprised or concerned that the officers appeared at her home at such a late hour. She would lead them to the parlor on the second floor where Anna, Nora, and Olivia were sitting. Major H.W. Smith would question who the ladies were. Mary would introduce them as officers would move to search the house for any other residents. Smith would tell the women that they were all being taken to General Christopher C. Agger's office for interrogation, while the other officers rounded up the remaining residents, of which the Hoolahans were not a part of, having moved out of the home the day before. Anna would become emotional, because it sounds like she was really emotional, and she would shout out, "Oh, mother, think of being taken down there for such a crime." This would lead Mary to place her arms around Anna's neck and whisper something in her ear that none of the officers heard. Whatever she told Anna, Anna was able to regain composure, which surprised Smith, who also noted that Mary never once asked why they were being arrested. While the women sat in the parlor awaiting a carriage to take them to be interrogated, Smith would tell Mary that due to the rain, she might like additional clothing for the ride. When Mary made a move to go to her room, she was informed by Smith that the house was under suspicion and that he must accompany her wherever she went. Detective John Clairvaux would guard the other ladies in the parlor to see that no papers were destroyed and that no communication passed between the ladies. Detectives Richard Morgan and another man named Sampson would arrive to then assist. The house was carefully searched. Every room in the house. This time, officers took their time to record details of the search and to collect possible evidence. Captain W.M. Wormiskirch would search Mary's room and find a photo of Booth hidden behind another photograph. Pictures of Confederate leaders, including Jefferson Davis, a bullet mold, and percussion caps used to ignite gunpowder, were also found in her room. In addition to the odd items found in her room of the boarding house, other items were retrieved from around the house, including miscellaneous papers, letters, lithographs, and carte de visite of mostly Confederate generals, one of which was a Confederate flag with the inscription, "Thus will it ever be with tyrants, Virginia, the mighty sic semper tyrannis," the same Latin phrase Booth used upon his escape from the theater. Prior to the arrival of the carriage, Mary would ask Smith if she could kneel and pray, which he didn't have a problem with. But just as she knelt to the floor, the sound of footsteps could be heard on the front steps, and Wormersmith and Morgan would hide behind the door, pistols drawn, expecting it to be the mysterious Mr. Kirby. The door was opened at the first knock, and this would be the knock that would be the unraveling of Booth's plot and Mary's fate to the gallows. The man who stood in the entryway was tall, muscular, and grimy, holding a pickaxe on his shoulder, and he seemed to be surprised to be greeted by Smith with a pistol in his hand. The mystery man said, "I guess I am mistaken," and the door would be shut behind him, trapping him in the entryway. Morgan would ask, "Whom do you want to see?" And the man replied, "Mrs. Surratt." He was told, "Then you are right. Walk in." The man, wearing a dark gray coat, dark pants, and a cap made from a sleeve of his shirt, because in that day it was inappropriate, I guess, for men to be out in public without a hat on their head, and he had made one out of a sleeve. But he was noted to be full of mud up to his knees nearly. His clothing did arouse suspicion due to the good quality of them. His pickaxe seemed to have never been used, and his hands were well manicured and not calloused. Mary would deny knowing the man, who appeared and later claimed that her extremely poor eyesight and the darkness of the room prevented her from recognizing him. He would be identified later as Louis Payne. Interesting to note is that he was standing underneath a bright light 5 feet from her when she made her statement that she didn't know who he was, and then said, "Oh, my poor eyesight, and it was dark." Was it? Powell Payne would be arrested along with Mary and the other ladies. Found in his possession was a box of pistol cartridges, a compass, hair pomade, a brush and comb, 2 handkerchiefs, and a copy of his oath of allegiance signed L. Payne. Though he claimed to be poor, barely making even $1 a day digging ditches, he had $25 in his pocket. Powell would be positively identified twice on April 18th, 1865, once by William Bell and later by Augustus Seward. It's not really known where Powell had been between the attack on Seward and the time he showed up at Mary's boarding house, but it is speculated that he was hiding in either a cemetery, even a tree for 3 days, a marble burial vault, or he was just simply walking the streets of D.C. What is known is that his overcoat was found discarded near Fort Bunker Hill, which contained his riding gloves, a false mustache, and a piece of paper with a woman's name and hotel room number on it. He didn't know the streets of D.C., didn't know what escape route was, and realized that Harold and Booth had pretty much abandoned him and left him to his own devices in D.C. Oh, great. So, the only place he knew where to end up was Mary's boarding house. He knew where that was. So, yeah. Unfortunate for everybody. Or fortunate. Anyway, what of the other conspirators? I'm going to get to them in the next part, as I'm trying to keep the history and the story interesting while also keeping them short enough that you'll watch them. If you would like to catch up on this series and you're not caught up, you can do that here. If you just want to watch other Miss History videos, you can also do that over here. Don't forget to let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Give this video a like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next part. Bye. Hello, and welcome back to Miss History and part 7 of the Mary Surrat Series. And if you've missed the first 6 episodes, I will link them in the description and up here. So when last we left off, Booth and Harold were making their way to Virginia. They would get fresh horses. They would continue to evade federal agents. Federal soldiers would return to Mary's boarding house on April 17th, 1865, again to search for John Jr., as well as to arrest Mary and any other people that were in the house at the time with her. The home would be searched. They would find a photo of Booth hidden behind another photo, as well as other suspicious items. Louis Payne would appear at the door at a late hour as well, and claim to be a ditch digger hired by Mary to dig a ditch in the morning. And Mary would claim that she didn't know him, and then later say that it was on account of her poor eyesight and the dim lighting that, she didn't recognize him, even though he was 5 feet away underneath a bright light. Still not knowing who he was, investigators would ask why he was showing up at such a late hour to dig a ditch, and he would say that he just wanted to know what time he was supposed to start in the morning. Totally understandable. Still, they didn't know who he was, but he would be arrested along with Mary, Anna, and the other 2 ladies that were in the boarding house. The Houlihan family had left the house the day before, and I'm not really sure where Weichman was. And before we get into everything, there might be a hiccup. I had some stuff happen in between filming part 6 and part 7. First was I had an allergic reaction to an eye cream. Seriously, it looked like somebody punched me in the eyes. And around that same time, our 13-year-old dog, we're pretty sure, had a stroke. And we had to put the dog down. So, forgive me if the conclusion, part 8, isn't out right away. I'm kind of feeling a certain kind of way and not really. None of it has to do with concluding the series right now. But my eyes are better. Anyway, for the first arrest, we have to go all the way back to the plot to kidnap Lincoln. And you'll remember Samuel Arnold. That plan, if you remember, fell apart when Lincoln opted not to travel to the country on March 16, 1865. Arnold would then take a clerk job in Old Point Comfort, Virginia, where he continued to be employed. After Booth assassinated Lincoln, Arnold would be arrested from his job for suspicion of being a conspirator in the assassination plot. He would admit to his role in the kidnapping, but he stated that he had nothing to do with the assassination plot, and his co-workers would support him on that, stating that he had actually been in Virginia working at the time of the assassination, and I'm pretty sure he didn't know that there was going to be an assassination plot. Oh, failed kidnapping? I'm out. Bye. I don't know. Poor guy. Michael O'Laughlin, who was also a part of the original plot to kidnap Lincoln, he would return to Baltimore. He would no longer be involved with Booth or any of the others. He would return, though, to D.C. on April 13th, 1865, the day before the assassination. No one is clear as to whether this was due to the new plot or just a social call to visit old friends and family. And when news came out about Booth's assassination of Lincoln, Payne's attempted assassination of Seward, O'Laughlin would have a crisis of conscience and voluntarily surrendered to the police on April 17th, 1865. Edmund Spangler, he was the stagehand at Ford's Theater. The night of the assassination, he was asked by Booth to hold his horse. Spangler would then ask another employee to do that because he said he had work to do. What work that was isn't clear, but Spangler would be questioned on April 15th, 1865, and then arrested on April 17th as an accomplice to Booth. George Asderod, assigned to assassinate Vice President Johnson, but elected to get drunk. Lose his nerve, drink more, then wander the streets of D.C. instead. It was on this walk that he was noticed by a woman dropping a knife in a nearby gutter. Asderod asked the bartender of the hotel that he was staying at and getting drunk where Johnson might be, which in turn had the employee contacting the police about a suspicious-looking man in a gray coat on April 15, 1865. Military police would conduct a search of Asderod's room the same day and find that he hadn't slept in his bed the night before. There was a loaded revolver under his pillow with a Bowie knife and a bank book belonging to Booth. Asderod would be arrested on April 20th, 1865, at the home of his cousin in Germantown, Maryland, 28 miles outside of D.C. I was going to wear my hair down, but it's 110 outside. Anyway, Dr. Samuel Mudd, possibly involved in the original plot to kidnap Lincoln, would split Booth's leg in the early morning hours of April 15, 1865, after Booth and Harold stopped at his house in Maryland on their way to Virginia. It's not really known if Mudd knew that Booth had assassinated Lincoln at the time he treated Booth's leg. What is known is that later that April 15th, while running errands, he would learn what had happened the night before. Mudd wanting to know what happened from Booth, would return to his home. And it's unclear if Booth and Harold were already gone, or if he had seen them as they were leaving, or if they left at his urging and with some assistance. Mudd would be questioned on April 18th, 1865, where he would state that he had never seen Booth and Harold. Friday, April 21st, Lieutenant Alexander Lovett would visit Mudd's home to arrest him. When Mudd learned that they would be searching his home, he said something to his wife, which would lead her to going upstairs and bringing back a boot. And Mudd would say that he cut it off of a man's leg, and then Lovett would turn the top down and see the name J. Wilkes written on it. On April 22nd, 1865, he would give a sworn statement where he talked about Booth visiting his home in November of 1864, but stated, "I have never seen Booth since that time, to my knowledge, until last Saturday morning." Mudd would be arrested and charged with conspiracy on April 26th, 1865. And I'm wondering if they caught him in lies, because we all know for a fact he saw Booth before April 15th, 1865. Booth and Harold made it out of D.C. by bribing their way out. They made it into Maryland, and they would eventually, after a wrong turn at Albuquerque, make it to Virginia on April 23rd, where they would make contact with Thomas Harbin, who would take them to William Bryant, where they got new horses. On April 24th, while Lincoln's funeral train was in New York City, Lieutenant Edward P. Daughtry would leave D.C. at 2 p.m. with a detachment of 26 Union soldiers to capture Booth in Virginia. They would travel on the Potomac by steamboat and land in Belle Plaine, Virginia, around 10 o'clock that night. Eventually, they would track Booth and Harold to Richard H. Garrett's farm, located 2 miles south of Port Royal, Virginia. Turns out the Garrett family had no knowledge of the assassination of Lincoln, as Confederate mail delivery had stopped with the surrender of the Confederacy. It was a former private in the 9th Virginia Cavalry who would take Booth and Harold to the Garrett farm. The family was introduced to Booth as James W. Boyd, and told that he was a Confederate soldier injured in the Battle of Petersburg and was returning home. Yay, lies. And I'm sorry, am I the only one that hears Port Royal and then I think Pirates of the Caribbean? Booth and Harold would have dinner with the Garrett family the night of April 24th, and it would be after that when Booth would learn of the surrender of Johnston's army, which was the last Confederate force of any size, and this would mean, without question, that the war was over, and Booth's attempt at saving it by assassinating Lincoln was an epic failure. On the morning of April 25th, Booth would tell the family that he intended to reach Mexico and drew a route from a map they had. In the meantime, Jet had been tracked down and questioned, and he would give up the location of Booth and Harold at the Garrett's farm. This would allow Daughtry and his soldiers to get to the Garrett farm in the pre-dawn hours of April 26th. Booth and Harold were hiding in the tobacco barn, and Harold would immediately surrender to the soldiers. Booth, however, refused to surrender, saying, "I prefer to come out and fight." With a broken leg? Really? That's what you're going to do? Well, with his refusal to come out of the barn, the soldiers would set it on fire. And while Booth moved around in the barn, he would be shot and killed by Sergeant Boston Corbett. Corbett would later say that he shot Booth because Booth, quote, raised his pistol to shoot. Lieutenant Colonel Everton Conger would say of Corbett killing Booth that he did so without order, pretext, or excuse, and would recommend Corbett be punished for disobeying orders to take Booth alive. Booth was pierced by a bullet that partially severed his spinal cord. It's reported that his dying words were, "Tell my mother I died for my country." Now, There are some people that say that Booth did not die that April night at the hands of Corbett. Allegedly, he escaped to the burning barn and fled the area without being noticed, with a splinted leg and on crutches. Sure. Sometime later, though, a dying man in Texas would confess to being Booth and having gotten away with what he did. The surviving Booth family refused to do any DNA tests on the dying man or the body that was buried in 1865. Finally, John Surratt Jr. Well, as it turns out, in January of 1865, he would transfer all of the title belonging to him of any of the family property to his mother, Mary. Why he did that is up for debate, but it is believed that due to his knowledge as a Confederate spy and his inclusion in the plots to both kidnap Lincoln, well, maybe he was a conspirator to assassinate, but definitely in the plot to kidnap Lincoln, he knew that his property could be seized, so he signed it over to Mary. John would join Booth and the others, Arnold and O'Laughlin, recruited in the kidnapping plot on March 17, 1865. But as stated, that plan would fall apart, so John would return to his courier activities for the Confederacy. In the early morning hours of April 15, 1865, Mary would claim that she thought that John was in Montreal, Canada, as she had received a letter from him postmarked from there. In reality, he was in Elmira, New York on the night of April 14th. He would then flee to Montreal, arrive there on April 17th. He would be given sanctuary at Saint Libore Catholic Church by Father Charles Boucher. There, he would remain until August of 1865, after which, aided by former Confederate agents, he would wear a disguise and book passage to Liverpool under the name John Watson. He would arrive in Liverpool, England in September of 1865 and lodged in the oratory of the Church of the Holy Cross, where he would serve for a time in the 9th Company of the Pontifical Juve and the Papal States. That's a lot of words. This didn't last long because a man by the name of Henry Beaumont de Sainte Marie, who met John in April of 1863, would recognize him and notify papal officials as well as U.S. minister in Rome. This would lead to John being arrested on November 7th, 1866, and sent to Velletri prison. John would escape and be sheltered by supporters of Garibaldi. He would eventually travel to the Kingdom of Italy, posing as a Canadian citizen by the name of Walters, and there he would book passage to Alexandria, Egypt. John would be arrested in Egypt on November 23rd, 1866 by U.S. officials and returned to the U.S. in early 1867. And now we circle back to Louis Weichmann. Weichmann would initially be suspected as having a part in all of the conspiracies due to his relationship with the Surratt family. He would actually be released from custody when it was learned that he had not been a part of the conspiracies. Weichmann would then go on to be a witness for the federal government in the trials that would follow. So what do you think? Do you think Booth died in that barn in 1865? Or was the dying man in Texas years later actually Booth? I mean, one rumor is Booth, I guess, hired another Confederate sympathizer that looks similar to him to go hang out in the barn with Harold, because apparently he knew they were coming, and then he rode away into the darkness of the night with a splint and on crutches. And don't you think that Harold, in an effort to save his own skin, would have said something like, that wasn't John Wilkes Booth? I don't know. I will be working on the conclusion. I'll kind of go over the trials, what happened, who. Louis Weichman played a huge role in the trials of everybody that was involved. And I guess you kind of got to wonder, did he know? How much did he know? I don't know. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And while you're down there, give this video a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. And I will see you for the conclusion of Mary Surratt. Bye. And now for something completely different, because my eyes, not as healed as I thought they were. But welcome back to Miss History and the conclusion of the Mary Surrat series. And if you've missed any of the previous episodes and you want to get caught up, then I will link them in the description box and also somewhere up here in a card on the screen. So now, let's get into the conclusion of Mary Surratt. So, you'll all remember, just a quick rundown, right? Mary would marry a man named John Surratt Sr. They would have 3 children, Isaac, Anna, and John Surratt Jr. They lived in Surrattsville, Maryland, which is present-day Clinton. When the Civil War broke out, Maryland would remain a part of the Union. The Surratts were Confederate sympathizers. They would host fellow sympathizers at their tavern, which they also used as a safe house for Confederate spies. Isaac would go to Texas to join the Confederate Army. John Jr. would become a courier. John Sr. would die sometime after the war started, and after the death of her husband, Mary would rent out the tavern in Surrattsville to a man by the name of John Lloyd, and then she would take possession of the family's townhome in D.C., which she converted into a boarding house, and the first boarder would be Louis Weichman, who was an old school chum of John Jr. For the Confederate spies, the most traveled route from Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, and Montreal, led through both Surrattsville and Washington, D.C., where Mary owned property in both places. And it's up for debate how much John Lloyd actually knew about any of the guests or the people that stayed at the tavern or the inn. Mary would be introduced to John Wilkes Booth in January of 1865. They would fast develop a very close bond. Mary would become a confidant to Booth. They shared a common hatred of Lincoln, the Union, and the abolitionist movement. Her boarding house would also become a safe house for Confederate activity. Booth would spend his days, according to witness testimony, at the house speaking with either John Jr. or Mary, sometimes for really long periods of time. In March of 1865, John Jr., George Asderod, and David Harold would hide weapons, ammunition, and other supplies in the walls and floorboards of the Surratt Tavern in preparation of the plot to kidnap Abraham Lincoln, which we all know fell apart when Lincoln changed his plans that day. This would result in Samuel Arnold finding work in Virginia, and Michael O'Laughlin would return to Baltimore. John Jr. would return to his courier duties, and Booth would shift gears and start to plot the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So if you watched part 7, you knew about all the arrests of all of the conspirators, and the trial for all of them would start on May 9th, 1865, and Mary would be tried with the other conspirators that were arrested: Louis Payne, George Asderod, David Harold, Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Laughlin, Dr. Samuel Mudd, and Edmund Spangler. The case would be heard before a military tribunal rather than in a civil court. I'm going to focus on some of the testimony for Mary and not the others. So we'll go back to April 2nd when Mary asked Weichman to go to the National Hotel to find Booth, saying that she needed to speak with him, and that if he were not there, then Weichman should find Asderod. So Weichman would find Asderod. Asderod would then have a private meeting with Mary while Weichman waited outside with the horses. April 3rd of 1865, John Jr. would arrive at the boarding house, unaware that Richmond had fallen and the Confederacy had been lost, and he didn't believe Weichman when Weichman told him. John would then exchange some of the gold that he had for cash and continue with his rebel activities, leaving for Montreal on the morning of April 4th. On April 11th, Mary asked Weichman to contact Booth to borrow his carriage for a trip to Surrattsville. Booth, having sold his carriage, would give Weichman $10 to rent one. Mary would then ask Weichman to accompany to Surrattsville, saying that she needed to collect a debt owed to her by John Nothey. On this way to Surrattsville, Weichman and Mary would pass John Lloyd. Lloyd and Mary would have a conversation that Weichman didn't hear, but Lloyd would testify that Mary told him to have the shooting irons ready. And up until that conversation, Lloyd said he had forgotten about the items stashed in the walls and floorboards of the tavern. Weichman would further testify that after her secret conversation with Lloyd that day, she would yell out to a woman named Emma Offutt, who was the sister-in-law of John Lloyd, that she, Mary, was going to help secure the release of Augustus Howell, who was a Confederate spy and courier who had been arrested at her tavern and imprisoned. On April 14th, 1865, Booth would come to the boarding house and have a secret meeting with Mary, where he gave her a package to deliver to the tavern. So Mary would have Weichman bring her again to Surrattsville, saying that she needed to collect a debt. Mary would then ask a man named Bennett Gwynn to deliver a note to Nothey, and once the letter left with Gwynn, Mary would take the package inside the tavern and ask where Lloyd was, and then would be told that he was in Marlborough, which was 2 hours away from Surrattsville. Lloyd would then arrive as Mary was deciding to leave, and he had supplies for the tavern that he started to unload. Gwynn testified that he saw Lloyd in Marlborough earlier on April 14th and that he appeared to have been drinking. And when Mary's attorney asked if Lloyd seemed considerably intoxicated, Gwynn replied, "I could hardly tell that. He acted like a man who had been drinking some." I don't know. Mary then would take the package that Booth had given her to the back of the tavern where Lloyd was. And when she was leaving, she would say to him, "Well, Mr. Lloyd, I want you to have those shooting irons ready. There will be parties here tonight who will call for them." She further instructed him to have the package from Booth and 2 bottles of whiskey ready, as they would also be called for that night. In various testimony giving to discredit Lloyd, witnesses would say that he had been drinking. One witness testified that he actually had drinks with Lloyd in Marlborough, and the two would return to Surrattsville. And like I said, Marlborough was 2 hours away from Surrattsville, and according to the witness, Lloyd was in full control of his horse and buggy and was not drinking on the ride home. It's a 2-hour ride, depending on how much I guess he drank in Marlborough. He probably wasn't that drunk. Mary and Weichman would return to D.C. around 8:30 at night on April 14th, where a large Union victory celebration was starting. And Mary would comment, "I am afraid all this rejoicing will be turned into mourning and all this glory into sadness." Weichman dropped Mary off at the boarding house. He returned to the horse and the buggy, and then the two of them would have a late dinner at the boarding house. Around 9 o'clock that night, a knock was heard on the second floor entrance, which Mary would answer. Weichman could not hear the conversation, nor did he know who the visitor was, but he assumed it to be the final visit from Booth for that day, which I suppose is very, very possible because the boarding house was located only a half a mile from Ford's Theater. This would have been enough time for Booth to have a visit with Mary and then arrive to the theater at 9:30. He apparently visited the house several times a day, according to testimony from Weichman. During the trial, Mary's defense would call Captain Cottingham to the stand. He was the officer who helped to arrest and interrogate John Lloyd. It was during his testimony that Cottingham would state that Lloyd finally broke down, saying that he feared for his life and that if he were to tell the truth, he feared he would be killed by the other conspirators, namely Booth, Harold, the Surratts, and Asderod. Cottingham would go on to say that during the interrogation of Lloyd would state that Mary had come to the tavern on the afternoon of April 14th and told him to have the guns and other items ready to be picked up. Lloyd would further state that Booth and Harold would arrive at the tavern around midnight and demand the items Mary told him to have ready, but he stated that one of the firearms had remained hidden due to Booth's leg injury, as he would need both of his hands to hold the horse. And if you've never ridden a horse, you got to grip it with your legs in order to stay on top, and you've got an injured leg, you got to hold on for dear life, apparently. It's not apparently. That's what you have to do. Lloyd said, "Oh, Mrs. Surratt, that vile woman, she has ruined me. I am to be shot. I am to be shot." According to Cottingham, that's what Lloyd said the day they went to arrest him. Mary was charged with abetting, aiding, concealing, counseling, and harboring her co-defendants. Attempts to find counsel for her and the others was difficult, as attorneys feared being accused of disloyalty to the Union should they accept the job. Mary would retain attorney Reverdy Johnson, and this would be challenged by a member of the military commission, as Johnson objected to requiring loyalty oaths from voters in the 1864 election. Those concerns would be dismissed. Johnson would appear to give up on defending Mary after the first week of testimony, which included statements by Weichman and Lloyd. And after then, he would routinely be absent, and so most of her case would be handled by two other less experienced attorneys, Frederick Aiken and John Wesley Clampett. Not like the Beverly Hillbillies. The fact that Mary remained quiet, even in meetings with her attorneys, did not help her. So according to my friend, who is the distant relative of Mary Surratt, he said her silence may have been due to her not wanting to give up her son in the kidnapping plot, or to give up any of the other conspirators. Maybe she had more to hide. At one point, as Aiken was questioning Captain Wormerskirch about the night of Mary's arrest, Wormerskirch would state that Mary requested him to wait a while, and she knelt and prayed a little. He then further added, "She knelt down, but whether she prayed or not, I cannot say." And this would have the courtroom fill with some laughter, which would cause Mary, typically face hidden by a black veil, to turn quickly around for a moment, and for an instant her veil was thrown aside, displaying a pair of flashing eyes, according to somebody that was sitting in the court. Once the prosecution rested, Aiken would then call a line of priests in to testify to Mary's piety as a good Christian woman who could not possibly have been involved in such a plot. 3 priests would be called, and each would say that they knew Mary, but none of them could say that they knew her well, nor if she was loyal to the Union. Eliza Houlihan would be called by Aiken. She was a one-time boarder at the boarding house with her husband and their 2 children. They're the family that moved out the day before Mary would be arrested. So April 16th, 1865, they would move out of the boarding house. Aiken would ask her about Lewis Payne showing up at the boarding house, posing as Reverend Wood, and Eliza testified that while she found him odd, he was understood to be a friend of the Surratts, and she felt it inappropriate to ask any questions. Eliza would also testify to George Astorad showing up at the boarding house, but she knew him only as port tobacco and knew that he was not welcome in the house according to Mary, which confused Eliza given the number of times he came to the house. When Aiken asked of Astorad, did he spend most of the time when he came there in the company of Miss Surratt? And Eliza would answer yes. He would ask for John Surratt, and if he was not there, he would inquire for Mrs. Surratt. And you'll recall that Mary, on the night of her arrest, she claimed poor eyesight, and that's why she didn't recognize Payne. Well, Eliza would be asked about Mary's poor eyesight. And Eliza would state that she never saw Mary read or sew by candlelight. However, when cross-examined, Eliza would state that Mrs. Surratt never appeared to have difficulty recognizing people by gaslight in the parlor. This would be backed up by testimony from another witness, Nora Fitzpatrick. Nora would further add that there had always been a photo of Booth in Mary's room, and this would be the photo that they found hidden behind another photo on the night of April 17th when they again searched the house and arrested Mary, the other ladies, and Payne. John Jr. did have an on and off girlfriend named Anna, and she testified that she had given a stack of letters from John postmarked in Montreal to Mary prior to the investigators coming to the house in the early morning hours of April 15th after the assassination. What happened to those letters was unknown to her, as they were not found in the boarding house when investigators returned on April 17th, 1865, and to this day, no one knows whatever happened to those letters, but given there was that other couple of days, the investigators came, they waited a couple of days and came back, I'm sure it's possible that Mary could have gotten rid of quite a bit of stuff that could have incriminated her. Aiken would then again call in a line of priests to testify again to Mary's pietous nature, much to the frustration and consternation of the court and the spectators. Again, they would say that they knew Mary, but they did not know her character or her loyalty to the Union. Yawn. He would then call a local shopkeeper to testify to the good character of Mary. Unfortunately, the shopkeeper said he couldn't vouch for Mary, stating, "It is only as a customer that I know her." I mean, he was trying. He tried. Aiken would then call John Nothey to the stand to inquire about the debt that he owed to Mary for land that he had purchased from her late husband. Now, he did state that he owed her money and that he did receive her letter, again asking for payment, as she had a debt owed to a man by the name of Mr. Calver in D.C. He testified that he didn't see her on April 14th, 1865, when she came to Surrattsville and had Mr. Gwynn deliver the letter to him. And I suppose this was an attempt to show that Mary had legitimate business in Surrattsville, and therefore the days that she was there could be easily explained, except that on April 14th, when she wrote in her letter to Mr. Nothey about the money, she gave him additional time to pay her. And she was delivering a package for Booth, and she was telling Mr. Lloyd to have items ready for pickup on April 14th. Augustus Howell, the guy that she was going to try and get out of prison, he would be called to the stand by Aiken. He was the guy that was arrested at the tavern in March of 1865 for being a Confederate spy and a blockade runner. Apparently, he was a frustration to authorities while he was imprisoned at Old Capitol the previous spring. He did not know all of the details of the kidnapping plot, and he was not at all involved in the assassination plot. He was, however, smart enough to understand that throwing Mary under the bus or any of the other conspirators would gain him very little. Howell would testify to knowing the Surratts for about a year and a half. He had even at one point stayed at Mary's boarding house in February. This is where he met Weichman, and Howell would testify that it was Weichman who was a sympathizer to the South, and he wanted to go to Richmond not to study theology, as he said, but to join the rebel government. And he would further state that Weichman gave him information about Confederate prisoners in Union prisons, which the Confederacy likely already knew about with the kidnapping plot to exchange Lincoln for said prisoners. This tactic to discredit Weichman would backfire, as Weichman had a bit of evidence regarding studying theology in Richmond despite the war. That was his plan. That's where he was going to do. So Howell's testimony did little to sway the court, as he was a man of dubious character, and it can't be said that the defense was much better due to the fact that they did not elect to bring into court the fact that he had been arrested for blockade running. That fact would come out on cross-examination by the tribunal. Whoops. Even more damning was that Howell would seemingly recall his conversations with Weichman oh so clearly, yet he could barely recall a single conversation with Mary. Anna Surratt would be called to testify, and she would claim that it was Weichman who introduced the conspirators to the house and met with them, not her mother. She would further state that her mother's eyesight was so poor that she couldn't even see friends on the street, nor could she read or sew by gaslight at night. Yet she was able to recognize Lloyd on the trip to Surrattsville on April 11th, 1865. That's curious. During direct examination, Anna would become agitated and start to cry out, "Where's Mama?" Not wanting the ladies the ability to exchange knowing glances or any kind of signs, a guard was placed in front of Mary in the prisoner's box. Anna would go on to become more agitated. The questioning was stopped. The judges on the tribunal chose not to do a cross-examination of her, as they felt that her state was too fragile and that she had been through so much. In fact, Anna had been in prison since the night of April 17th, 1865, and had not seen her mother since April 30th, which was 1 month before her testimony. Anna would be released from prison. She had no family, no home, no money. She would stay for a time with family in Prince George's County, but she couldn't be away from her mother. It really broke her up to be away from her mother. So some accommodating friends would allow her to stay with them in D.C., where she would then spend the remainder of the trial sitting behind her mother. The case was lengthy, as one would imagine, trying all of the defendants at the same time. Now, arguments were made about the case being in a military tribunal and not a civil court, as it was peacetime. And each time it was brought up, it was dismissed. The reason was, in 1865, there was a feeling that the South was involved in the assassination, and the conspiracy was more widespread. D.C. was still considered a war zone with Confederate troops still in the field, and it was argued that assassination was an act of war. Unlike civil court, the defendants were not permitted to speak on their own behalf. The case would end on June 28th, and the deliberation and verdicts would be swift. Mary Surratt, Louis Payne, George Asderod, and David Harold would all be sentenced to death for their roles in the conspiracy. Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Laughlin, and Dr. Samuel Mudd would be sentenced to life in prison. Dr. Mudd only escaped the death penalty by 1 vote. It was believed that O'Laughlin was assigned to assassinate General Ulysses S. Grant, and that's why he was back in D.C. on the night of the assassination of Lincoln. But, like Asderod, he would have second thoughts and get drunk instead. Edmund Spangler would be sentenced to 6 years in prison. Mary, Payne, Asderod, and Harold would be hanged July 7th, 1865, with Mary being the first woman to be executed by the federal government. An outbreak of yellow fever would come to Fort Jefferson, where the remaining prisoners were being held, in August of 1867. Dr. Mudd, with the assistance of Spangler, would treat those who caught it. Michael O'Laughlin would die of the disease in September of 1867. On March 1st, 1869, President Johnson would pardon Spangler, Dr. Mudd, and Samuel Arnold, and they would be released from prison. After the death of her mother, Anna would be alone. John was still in hiding in 1865. Isaac was still away, far, far away, having left to fight for the Confederacy. She could not bear to live in the boarding house. For the next few years, she would live with friends. The boarding house had been mortgaged by her mother to pay legal fees, and that would be sold in November of 1867. The property in Surrattsville was sold in March of 1869. Anna would eventually marry on June 17, 1869, in a private ceremony at St. Patrick's Church in D.C., with both of her brothers in attendance, as Isaac had returned from the war. Anna and her husband would move to Baltimore near her brothers. She would go on to have children and die of kidney disease in 1904. Isaac had returned from the war. He was unaware of the death of his mother until years later because he was in Europe. He would live in Baltimore near his family. He never married, and he would die of indigestion in 1907. And I know you're thinking, how on earth did John end up free? Well, he was tried in a civil court 18 months after Mary's execution. This had to do with the case Ex parte Milligan, declaring the trial of civilians before a military tribunal was unconstitutional if civilian courts were open. The trial was 2 months long, and in the case, it was admitted that, John had been a part of the kidnapping plot, but not the assassination plot. The trial ended in a mistrial, and due to the statute of limitations having run out on all the charges except murder, John was released on bail. He would give a lecture on December 6, 1870, admitting his involvement in the kidnapping plot, but maintained that he knew nothing of the assassination plot. He would come to revile Louis Weichman, calling him a perjurer responsible for his mother's death. John would get married in 1872, have 7 children, and die of pneumonia in 1916. As for Louis Weichman, he would move to Anderson, Indiana, start a business, and then become a controversial and sometimes ostracized person by people due to lingering doubts as to the truth and his motives in the trial. There was backlash against him for his testimony that allowed for the first woman to be executed by the federal government. Prior to his death, he swore an affidavit affirming that all his testimony about the assassination was completely true. He would die in 1902 and be buried under the original spelling of his last name. Now, according to my friend, quote, most of the stories I heard growing up were conspiracy theories about Mary as she was hung for the situation and didn't sell anyone out, which made it appear that she had much more to hide. So over generations, the story grew, and it was assumed that she was a bigger part than we see on record, and her silence was to either protect the movement and army operatives or simply to protect her son. Descendants of Mary Surratt have since changed the spelling of their last name. I know this has been a really long one, and not that it has not been interesting. And there is so much more that I could have gone into. But at the end of the day, if you want to know more of the particulars of the case, I'd recommend the book, The Assassin's Accomplice, Mary Surratt and the Plot to Kill Abraham Lincoln by Kate Clifford Larson. And I will also link this really amazing website. I can't think of the name of it off the top of my head. I just discovered it the other day. I'll link that down in the description box. It goes through day-by-day trial, all of the witness testimony, diary stuff from some of the people that were in attendance. It was really fascinating. And if you're a history nerd like me, you'd probably love it. So, I'm thinking my red swollen eyes will add to what I have coming up in October as far as makeup goes. So I'll be working on that to get a couple of episodes up next month. And I hope that you will join me for any future videos. And if you like this content, then give it a thumbs up. And please consider subscribing. Let me know your thoughts on all of this down in the comments below. And what do you think I should talk about next? Anyway, have a great day, and I will see you next time. Bye.